The year 1028 marked a pivotal moment in Norman history, though few could have predicted the extraordinary consequences of a liaison between Duke Robert I of Normandy and a young woman named Herleva from the town of Falaise. This union, conducted outside the bonds of marriage, produced a son who would forever alter the course of European civilization. William, born into a world where legitimacy, determined inheritance and bastardy carried the weight of social stigma, entered life bearing a burden that would simultaneously drive his ambitions and complicate his path to power. Duke Robert I, known to contemporaries as Robert the Magnificent or Robert the Devil depending on their perspective, ruled Normandy during a period of consolidation and expansion. The duchy itself remained a relatively young political entity, established by the Viking leader Rollo through the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte in 911. By Robert's time, the Norman nobility had developed into a formidable warrior class, combining Scandinavian martial traditions with Frankish feudal structures and an increasing adoption of Christian practices. Robert's court attracted ambitious knights, clerics seeking advancement, and merchants capitalizing on Normandy's growing prosperity. Herleva, daughter of Fulbert, represented an entirely different social stratum. Her father worked as a tanner in Falaise, a profession that, while necessary, occupied a lower rung of medieval society's rigid hierarchy. Tanners dealt with animal hides and the chemicals required to process them, work that often relegated them to the outskirts of towns due to the odours and waste products involved. The exact circumstances of Robert and Herleva's meeting remain shrouded in legend and speculation, though contemporary sources suggest their relationship developed during one of the Duke's visits to Falaise. What emerges clearly from the historical record is that their union, while not sanctified by marriage, produced genuine affection and mutual respect. The birth of their son William created immediate complications for Norman succession law. Medieval inheritance practices heavily favoured legitimate offspring, and bastards faced significant legal and social obstacles in claiming their father's titles and properties. However, Norman customs proved somewhat more flexible than those found elsewhere in France, partly due to the duchy's relatively recent establishment and the pragmatic attitudes inherited from Viking traditions. Scandinavian societies had historically recognised the rights of illegitimate children under certain circumstances, particularly when no legitimate heirs existed. Robert's recognition of William as his son carried profound political implications. The Duke publicly acknowledged the boy, ensuring he received appropriate education and training befitting his noble blood. This recognition, however, created tension within the Norman nobility. Many barons viewed William's elevation with suspicion, seeing an opportunity to challenge ducal authority or advance their own interests should succession disputes arise. The concept of legitimacy in medieval society extended beyond mere legal technicalities. It encompassed divine sanction, noble acceptance, and the ability to command loyalty through strength and political acumen. The young William's bastard status manifested in numerous ways throughout his childhood. Contemporary chroniclers, particularly those writing after his later successes, often emphasized how this stigma motivated his drive for achievement and recognition. The epithet "the bastard" followed him throughout his early years, serving as both an identifier and a constant reminder of his irregular birth. This designation carried particular weight in a society where genealogy and bloodline legitimacy formed the foundation of political authority. Norman nobility during William's youth operated within a complex web of rivalries, alliances, and territorial ambitions. The duchy's barons controlled substantial holdings and maintained their own military forces, creating a constant potential for internal conflict. These nobles had originally arrived in Normandy as followers of Rollo and subsequent Viking leaders, receiving land grants in exchange for military service and loyalty. By the 1030s, many of these families had established themselves as hereditary powers within their respective regions, developing interests that sometimes conflicted with ducal authority. The political landscape of Normandy reflected broader patterns occurring throughout medieval France. The weakening of Carolingian royal authority had created opportunities for regional nobles to assert greater independence. Dukes, counts, and other territorial magnates increasingly operated as semi-autonomous rulers within their domains. This decentralization of power meant that effective leadership required constant negotiation, military readiness, and the ability to balance competing interests among powerful vassals. Duke Robert's decision to embark on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 1034 precipitated a succession crisis that would define William's adolescence. Medieval pilgrimages, particularly to the Holy Land, carried significant risks due to the distances involved, hostile territories, and the general dangers of long-distance travel. Robert's departure represented both a spiritual commitment and a political gamble. Before leaving Normandy, he assembled the duchy's leading nobles and secured their oath of loyalty to William as his designated heir. This formal recognition ceremony at Fécamp demonstrated Robert's determination to establish William's legitimacy, despite his irregular birth. The assembled barons, including powerful figures like Gilbert of Brienne, Osbin the Seneschal, and Turchatil of Neufmarche, swore fealty to the young William. However, the sincerity of these oaths would soon face severe testing. Medieval oath-taking carried sacred significance, invoking divine punishment for violations, yet political realities often proved stronger than spiritual commitments. Robert's death in Nicaea during his return journey in 1035 transformed 7-year-old William from a duke's acknowledged bastard into Normandy's ruler. The transition exposed the fragility of Norman political structures and the extent to which personal loyalty to Robert had maintained stability. Without the duke's commanding presence, ambitious nobles began calculating their opportunities for advancement or independence. The minority rule that followed Robert's death unleashed forces that had remained contained during the previous duke's lifetime. William's youth made him dependent on regents and guardians, creating opportunities for manipulation and control. The most significant early protector was Archbishop Robert of Rouen, the young duke's great-uncle and brother to Duke Richard II. The archbishop's position provided him with both spiritual authority and significant temporal power, making him a natural choice to oversee William's interests during his minority. Archbishop Robert's protection proved crucial during the turbulent years following Duke Robert's death. The prelate's ecclesiastical status offered some protection against direct violence, while his family connections to the ducal line provided legitimacy for his guardianship role. However, even his influence could not prevent the outbreak of violence that characterized William's early rule. The archbishop's death around 1037 removed a stabilizing influence and left the young duke increasingly vulnerable to the ambitions of Norman barons. The guardianship system that developed around William involved several key figures, each bringing different strengths and motivations to their protective roles. Gilbert of Brienne, appointed as William's guardian, represented one of Normandy's most powerful baronial families. His extensive holdings in central Normandy and his military capabilities made him a formidable protector, but also a potential threat should his loyalties shift. Gilbert's assassination around 1040 demonstrated the deadly nature of Norman politics and the constant danger surrounding those associated with William's cause. Osbin the Seneschal, another crucial figure in William's early protection, served as the ducal steward and maintained significant influence over administrative matters. His position required him to balance the competing demands of various noble factions while attempting to preserve ducal authority during William's minority. The Seneschal's role involved managing the duchy's resources, overseeing legal proceedings, and maintaining communication between the ducal court and regional nobles. Turchatil of Neufmarche provided military leadership and strategic counsel during these dangerous years. His experience in warfare and his loyalty to the ducal family made him invaluable in protecting William from the numerous threats that emerged during his minority. The complexity of these guardianship arrangements reflected the precarious nature of William's position and the need to balance different interests within the Norman nobility. The assassination attempts against William during his minority rule revealed the extent of opposition to his continued rule. These plots involved various combinations of Norman barons, each motivated by different objectives ranging from personal advancement to fundamental opposition to bastard rule. The most serious threats came from members of the extended ducal family who possessed alternative claims to Norman leadership. The violent atmosphere surrounding William's court during these years created an environment of constant vigilance and suspicion. Trusted advisors faced regular threats, and the young duke's movements required careful planning and protection. The murder of several key supporters, including Gilbert of Brienne, demonstrated that association with William's cause carried potentially fatal consequences. These early experiences of betrayal, violence, and political instability profoundly shaped William's character and approach to leadership. The constant threat of assassination taught him the importance of personal security measures and the need to carefully evaluate the loyalty of those around him. The loss of protective figures like Archbishop Robert and Gilbert of Brienne forced him to develop independence and decision-making capabilities at an unusually young age. The broader context of these struggles involved complex relationships with neighbouring powers, including the French crown and rival Norman claimants. King Henry V of France maintained interests in Norman affairs, sometimes supporting William's position and sometimes encouraging his opponents depending on broader political calculations. These external influences added additional layers of complexity to an already volatile situation. The survival of William's rule through this tumultuous period required not only the protection of loyal guardians, but also the gradual development of his own political and military capabilities. The young duke began learning the arts of warfare, diplomacy and governance while simultaneously fighting for his life and throne. This combination of theoretical education and practical experience in crisis management would prove invaluable in his later conquests and administrative achievements. By 1047, the 17-year-old William faced the most serious challenge to his authority since assuming the ducal title. The conspiracy that emerged represented far more than mere baronial discontent. It constituted a coordinated attempt to overthrow his rule and install an alternative claimant to the Norman throne. The rebellion's leadership included some of Normandy's most powerful nobles, among them Ranulf, Viscount of Bayeux, and his nephew Guy of Burgundy, who possessed legitimate claims through their connection to Duke Richard III, William's uncle who had briefly ruled Normandy before Robert I. The rebels' grievances extended beyond simple opposition to bastard rule. Many Norman barons had grown increasingly frustrated with the centralisation of ducal power that had occurred under William's guardians. The Regency period had seen efforts to strengthen ducal authority at the expense of baronial independence, creating resentment among nobles accustomed to greater autonomy. Additionally, the economic pressures of maintaining military forces and fortifications during the unstable minority period had strained many baronial resources, leading some to view rebellion as a path to seizing ducal lands and revenues. The conspiracy's geographic scope encompassed much of western Normandy, with strongholds at Bayeux serving as coordination centres for rebel activities. The rebels controlled significant territories along the Cotentin Peninsula and had established communication networks extending into Brittany, where they sought support from Duke Alan III. This Breton connection provided the rebels with potential military assistance and secure bases of operation beyond William's immediate reach. Intelligence regarding the rebellion's scope reached William through a network of loyal informants, including clerics and minor nobles who remained committed to the legitimate ducal line. The young duke's response demonstrated both his growing political acumen and his willingness to seek external assistance when facing overwhelming odds. Rather than attempting to confront the rebellion with limited Norman resources, William made the crucial decision to appeal directly to King Henry I of France for military support. The journey to the French court required careful planning and significant personal risk. William travelled with a small escort through territories where rebel sympathies ran strong, reaching the royal court at Poissy, where Henry I maintained residence. The meeting between the young Norman duke and the French king represented a pivotal moment in medieval diplomacy, with William successfully arguing that the rebellion threatened not only Norman stability, but also French royal interests in maintaining a loyal vassal in Normandy. King Henry's decision to provide military assistance reflected complex political calculations extending beyond simple feudal obligations. The French crown had consistently sought to prevent any single Norman faction from becoming too powerful or independent. Supporting William against the rebels served to maintain the balance of power within Normandy, while ensuring continued Norman dependence on French royal support. Additionally, Henry recognised that a successful rebellion might install rulers less amenable to French influence than the young William, who clearly required ongoing royal backing to maintain his position. The royal army that marched into Normandy in early 1047 represented a formidable military force by contemporary standards. Henry thus brought approximately 3,000 troops, including heavily armoured cavalry, infantry units, and siege specialists capable of reducing rebel fortifications. The French contingent included experienced commanders who had participated in previous campaigns against rebellious vassals, providing tactical expertise that complemented William's intimate knowledge of Norman terrain and political dynamics. The rebels, meanwhile, had assembled their own substantial forces centred around the traditional military obligations of their feudal holdings. Ranulf of Bayeux commanded approximately 2,000 men, while Guy of Burgundy contributed additional forces drawn from his supporters in the Cotentin. The rebel army included experienced Norman knights renowned for their martial prowess, as well as infantry units recruited from their territorial holdings. Their position at Valles-Dunes, near Caen, offered strategic advantages including defensible terrain and proximity to their primary support bases. The Battle of Valles-Dunes unfolded on a plain southeast of Caen, with both armies deploying according to contemporary tactical principles. The rebels positioned their forces to maximise the effectiveness of their cavalry charges while maintaining defensive options should the battle turn against them. William and Henry III arranged their combined forces in traditional formation, with heavy cavalry forming the primary striking force supported by infantry units and archers positioned to disrupt enemy formations. The battle commenced with preliminary skirmishing between advance units, as both sides sought to identify enemy dispositions and test their opponent's resolve. The rebel forces initially demonstrated their formidable fighting capabilities, with Norman knights executing disciplined cavalry charges that created significant pressure on the royal army's flanks. However, the superior numbers and coordination of the combined royal ducal forces began to tell as the engagement intensified. William's personal participation in the battle marked his transition from protected ward to active military commander. Contemporary accounts describe the young duke fighting alongside seasoned French knights, demonstrating both physical courage and tactical awareness that impressed his royal ally. His presence on the battlefield served crucial morale purposes, showing Norman loyalists that their duke possessed the martial qualities expected of medieval rulers. The decisive moment came when a coordinated charge by William and Henry's heavy cavalry broke through rebel defensive lines, creating chaos within enemy ranks. The psychological impact of seeing their formations collapse triggered widespread panic among rebel forces, leading to a general retreat that quickly transformed into a rout. Many prominent rebels, including Guy of Burgundy, fell during the pursuit phase, while others fled toward Breton territories or sought sanctuary in religious establishments. Ranulf of Bayeux's capture during the battle's aftermath eliminated the rebellion's primary leadership and effectively ended organised resistance to William's rule. The Viscount's subsequent imprisonment demonstrated William's growing understanding of political necessity, as executing such a prominent noble might have created martyrdom and ongoing resentment among his supporters. Instead, the Duke chose imprisonment as a means of neutralising the threat, while avoiding the blood feuds that might result from execution. The victory at Valles Dunes provided William with both immediate security and long-term political advantages. The defeat of the rebellion eliminated the most serious internal threat to his rule while demonstrating his capability as a military commander. Equally important, the successful collaboration with French royal forces established William's credentials as a reliable vassal worthy of continued support from the crown. The battle's aftermath required careful management to consolidate William's strengthened position without creating new sources of opposition. The Duke's approach to defeated rebels demonstrated sophisticated political judgment, combining punishment for leaders with reconciliation opportunities for lesser participants. Many rebel knights received pardons in exchange for renewed oaths of loyalty, while their lands remained subject to ducal oversight to prevent future conspiracies. The redistribution of confiscated rebel properties allowed William to reward his supporters while strengthening ducal control over strategic territories. Loyal nobles received grants of rebel lands, creating new bonds of obligation while placing trusted administrators in formerly rebellious regions. This redistribution process required delicate balancing to avoid creating new grievances among existing landholders, while ensuring effective control over recovered territories. The consolidation period following Valais Dunes witnessed William's systematic effort to strengthen his position through strategic marriages and alliances. The Duke's own marriage negotiations with Matilda of Flanders, daughter of Count Baldwin V, represented the most significant of these diplomatic initiatives. This proposed union offered multiple advantages, including alliance with one of Europe's most powerful noble houses, enhanced legitimacy through connection to impeccable bloodlines, and potential military support from Flemish forces. The marriage negotiations encountered significant obstacles, primarily from ecclesiastical authorities who raised questions about consanguinity between William and Matilda. Canon law prohibited marriages between individuals related within 7 degrees, and genealogical research suggested potential violations of these requirements. The papal prohibition issued by Leo IX created a diplomatic crisis that required years of negotiation and political manoeuvring to resolve. William's persistence in pursuing the Flemish marriage, despite papal opposition, demonstrated his growing confidence and political sophistication. The Duke employed diplomatic pressure, ecclesiastical allies, and legal arguments to overcome religious objections, eventually securing papal approval through a combination of political concessions and religious commitments. The successful resolution of this crisis enhanced William's reputation as a skilled negotiator capable of managing complex international relationships. The military innovations that emerged during William's consolidation of power reflected both practical necessity and strategic vision. The Duke's experiences during the rebellion had demonstrated the limitations of traditional Norman military organisation, particularly regarding coordination between different noble contingents and the integration of infantry support with cavalry operations. The reforms implemented following Valais Dunes addressed these weaknesses while building upon Norman strengths in mounted warfare. The development of combined arms tactics represented perhaps the most significant of these innovations. William's military theorists, drawing upon lessons learned during the rebellion and subsequent campaigns, developed integrated approaches that maximised the effectiveness of different military units. Heavy cavalry remained the primary striking force, but their operations became more closely coordinated with infantry formations and archery units to create tactical flexibility unavailable to traditional feudal armies. The evolution of Norman cavalry techniques during this period established foundations for the military successes that would characterise William's later conquests. The Duke's forces developed sophisticated methods for coordinating multiple cavalry charges, maintaining formation discipline during extended engagements, and executing tactical withdrawals when circumstances required defensive operations. These innovations required extensive training and discipline that distinguished Norman forces from many contemporary armies. The relationship between William and King Henry I underwent significant transformation following the successful suppression of the rebellion. Initially characterised by clear hierarchical distinctions between royal overlord and dependent vassal, the relationship gradually evolved toward greater equality as William's power and confidence increased. The Duke's growing military capabilities and territorial control made him an increasingly valuable ally rather than merely a subordinate requiring protection. This evolving dynamic created both opportunities and tensions within the broader framework of French royal politics. Henry recognised the advantages of maintaining Norman loyalty and military support for royal campaigns, but he also became increasingly aware of the potential threat posed by an overly powerful Norman duke. The king's subsequent policies toward Normandy reflected these competing considerations, alternating between support and subtle opposition depending on changing political circumstances. The transformation of William from dependent vassal to formidable rival occurred gradually through a series of military campaigns and diplomatic initiatives that demonstrated his growing capabilities. The Duke's successful interventions in Maine and his expanding influence along Norman borders created a power base that rivaled traditional French noble houses. This growth inevitably generated tensions with royal authority, setting the stage for future conflicts between Norman and French interests. The death of Edward the Confessor on January 5, 1066, precipitated the most complex succession crisis in English history, unleashing competing claims that would reshape the political landscape of medieval Europe. Edward's reign, spanning nearly 24 years, had been marked by his apparent inability or unwillingness to produce an heir, creating a vacuum that multiple claimants would seek to fill through various combinations of legal argument, political manoeuvring, and military force. The king's final years had witnessed increasing speculation about succession arrangements, with different factions at the English court promoting their preferred candidates while Edward himself remained characteristically enigmatic about his intentions. The immediate succession fell to Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, and the most powerful noble in England, whose election by the Witenagemot occurred with remarkable speed following Edward's death. Harold's claim rested primarily on his selection by the English noble assembly, a legitimising mechanism that carried significant weight within Anglo-Saxon political tradition. The Witenagemot's decision reflected both practical considerations about Harold's capability to rule effectively and recognition of the Godwinson family's dominant position within the English political hierarchy. Harold possessed extensive administrative experience, having effectively governed England during Edward's periods of illness and withdrawal from active rule. Yet Harold's rapid coronation at Westminster Abbey on January 6, 1066, merely one day after Edward's death, suggested awareness that his claim faced serious challenges. The unprecedented speed of these proceedings indicated concern about allowing time for alternative claimants to organise opposition or present competing arguments to the English nobility. Traditional succession practices typically involved longer deliberation periods, allowing for consultation with regional nobles and consideration of various candidates' qualifications and claims. William's assertion of his right to the English throne rested on fundamentally different foundations, combining alleged promises from Edward the Confessor with claims about Harold Godwinson's sworn oath of support. According to Norman sources, particularly William of Jumièges and later chroniclers, Edward had designated William as his heir during a visit to Normandy in 1051 or through subsequent diplomatic communications. This designation allegedly reflected Edward's gratitude for Norman support during his exile and his recognition of family connections through his mother Emma, who had been married to both Ethelred the Unready and Cnut the Great. The historical accuracy of Edward's supposed promise remains one of medieval history's most contentious questions. Norman chroniclers presented detailed accounts of Edward's designation, describing formal ceremonies and witness testimonies that supported William's claim. However, English sources from the period make no mention of such arrangements, and Edward's documented actions during his final years suggest no clear preference for Norman succession. The king's decision to recall Edward the Exile, son of Edmund Ironside, from Hungary in 1057 indicated potential interest in restoring the traditional Anglo-Saxon royal line, though Edward the Exile's death shortly after his return eliminated this possibility. The most crucial element in William's claim involved Harold Godwinson's alleged oath of fealty, sworn during Harold's mysterious journey to Normandy around 1064. The circumstances surrounding this visit have generated extensive scholarly debate, with Norman and English sources providing contradictory accounts of Harold's motivations, activities and commitments during his stay in the duchy. Norman chroniclers, writing primarily after the conquest, described Harold's journey as a diplomatic mission authorised by Edward the Confessor to confirm William's succession rights and Harold's own acceptance of Norman claims. According to the Norman version of events, Harold's ship encountered storms while crossing the Channel, forcing him to land in Ponthieu, where Count Guy captured him and held him for ransom. William's intervention secured Harold's release, after which the English Earl accompanied the Norman Duke on military campaigns in Brittany, demonstrating his prowess in battle and earning William's respect and friendship. The climax of Harold's visit allegedly occurred at Bayeux, where he swore a sacred oath on holy relics to support William's claim to the English throne and to marry one of William's daughters, cementing the alliance between Norman and English interests. The English perspective on Harold's journey presents a markedly different interpretation of events. English chroniclers suggested that Harold's voyage occurred without Edward's authorization and resulted from the Earl's personal interests, possibly involving efforts to secure the release of family members held hostage in Normandy since the political upheavals of 1051. This version portrays Harold's oath, if it occurred at all, as extracted under duress and therefore lacking moral or legal validity, according to contemporary understanding of coerced commitments. The question of oath validity involved complex theological and legal considerations that reflected broader medieval debates about the nature of sworn obligations. Canon law recognised that oaths extracted through force or deception lacked binding power, providing potential justification for Harold's subsequent actions. However, the specific circumstances of Harold's oath remained disputed, with Norman sources emphasising the voluntary nature of his commitment and the sacred character of the relics upon which he swore. The Bayeux tapestry, commissioned after the conquest, depicts Harold's oath-taking as a solemn ceremony conducted before witnesses and blessed religious objects, suggesting Norman determination to establish the oath's legitimacy. The religious dimensions of the succession crisis proved crucial in determining the ultimate outcome of competing claims. Pope Alexander II's support for William's cause provided international legitimacy that transformed the Norman invasion from a mere territorial dispute into a divinely sanctioned mission to restore rightful authority and reform English ecclesiastical practices. Papal backing reflected broader concerns about the English Church's relationship with Rome and allegations of irregular practices that had developed during the Anglo-Saxon period. The papal bull authorising William's invasion cited multiple justifications, including Harold's alleged perjury in breaking his oath to William, irregularities in Harold's coronation, and concerns about English ecclesiastical independence from Roman authority. Archbishop Stigand of Canterbury's controversial position provided particularly compelling grounds for papal intervention, as his appointment had occurred during a period of disputed papal succession and his legitimacy remained questionable under strict canonical interpretation. Stigand's continued tenure despite papal objections symbolised broader English resistance to Roman ecclesiastical authority. William's diplomatic campaign to secure papal support involved extensive negotiations conducted through trusted intermediaries, including Lanfranc of Bec, who possessed both theological expertise and political acumen necessary for such delicate discussions. The Norman delegation presented detailed arguments, about English ecclesiastical irregularities, while emphasising William's commitment to church reform and proper canonical observance. These negotiations required careful balance between asserting legitimate grievances and avoiding accusations of Norman aggression that might undermine papal sympathy. The papal banner granted to William carried profound symbolic significance that extended far beyond its practical military value. Medieval warfare possessed strong religious dimensions, with victory or defeat often interpreted as divine judgment on the righteousness of competing causes. The papal blessing transformed William's invasion into a holy war, providing moral authority that helped recruit supporters and justify the enormous costs and risks involved in mounting a cross-channel invasion. The months following Edward's death witnessed intensive diplomatic activity as various claimants sought to strengthen their positions through alliances and international support. William's agents operated throughout Europe, presenting the Norman case to potential allies and seeking to isolate Harold diplomatically. These efforts achieved particular success in Flanders, where Count Baldwin V's family connections to both Norman and English courts provided opportunities for influence. Baldwin's daughter Matilda's marriage to William created obvious Flemish interests in Norman success, while his son-in-law relationship with Harold through Judith of Flanders complicated his position. Harold Hardrada's entry into the succession dispute added a third major claimant whose presence would prove crucial to the ultimate resolution of the crisis. The Norwegian king's claim rested on agreements allegedly made between his predecessor Magnus and Harthacnut, the last Danish king of England, providing for mutual succession rights should either die without heirs. This Scandinavian claim possessed historical precedent through Sinute's earlier conquest of England and the continued presence of Danish and Norwegian elements within English political structures. Hardrada's alliance with Tostig Godwinson, Harold's exiled brother, created a formidable northern threat that would force Harold to divide his attention and resources between multiple fronts. Tostig's knowledge of English defensive preparations and his continuing support among northern nobles provided the Norwegian invasion with insider intelligence and potential local assistance. The partnership between Hardrada and Tostig reflected the complex factional divisions within English politics, where family loyalties competed with broader national interests. The Norwegian king's military reputation added credibility to his claim that extended beyond mere legal arguments. Hardrada's career as a mercenary commander in the Byzantine Empire and his subsequent campaigns throughout Scandinavia had established him as one of Europe's most feared military leaders. His forces included experienced veterans from multiple campaigns, elite Huscarls renowned for their discipline and fighting prowess, and substantial naval resources capable of transporting large armies across the North Sea. The strategic implications of facing simultaneous invasions from Norway and Normandy presented Harold with an impossible military situation that would ultimately prove decisive in determining the succession outcome. English defensive resources, while substantial, could not effectively counter major invasions on both northern and southern coasts simultaneously. Harold's decision to position his forces in the south to counter the expected Norman invasion left the north vulnerable to Hardrada's assault, while any concentration of forces in the north would provide William with unopposed landing opportunities. The diplomatic manoeuvring during 1066 revealed the sophisticated intelligence networks that connected medieval European courts. William's agents maintained regular communication with supporters in England, providing updates on Harold's military preparations and political developments that might affect invasion planning. Similarly, Harold's representatives operated throughout Europe, seeking to counter Norman diplomatic initiatives and secure alternative sources of support for English independence. The economic dimensions of the succession crisis proved equally significant in determining the ultimate outcome. William's invasion preparations required enormous financial resources to construct ships, recruit soldiers, purchase supplies, and maintain forces during extended campaign periods. The Norman treasury, while substantial, required supplementation through loans from Italian merchants and contributions from ecclesiastical institutions supporting the papal cause. These financial arrangements created additional stakeholders in Norman success, while demonstrating the expedition's unprecedented scale. Harold's defensive preparations involved similar economic challenges, as maintaining large armies in constant readiness imposed severe strains on English resources. The feared system, while providing substantial manpower, could not sustain extended mobilization periods without disrupting agricultural activities essential for economic survival. The timing of invasions during harvest season created particular difficulties, forcing choices between military necessity and economic requirements. The intelligence warfare that preceded the military campaigns involved extensive networks of spies, merchants, and clerics who provided crucial information about enemy preparations and intentions. William's intelligence regarding English defensive arrangements influenced his invasion timing and landing site selection, while Harold's knowledge of Norman preparations affected his strategic deployments. The quality and accuracy of intelligence would prove decisive in determining campaign outcomes, as medieval warfare offered little margin for error in strategic planning. The psychological dimensions of the succession crisis reflected broader medieval beliefs about divine judgment and legitimate authority. Harold's rapid coronation and subsequent military preparations demonstrated confidence in his legal position, while William's extensive diplomatic campaign revealed understanding that military success alone would not provide lasting legitimacy. The competing propaganda efforts sought to influence both domestic and international opinion, recognizing that post-conquest stability would require broad acceptance of the victor's authority. The magnitude of William's logistical undertaking in preparing for the invasion of England represented one of the most ambitious military enterprises of the medieval period, requiring coordination across multiple kingdoms and the mobilization of resources on an unprecedented scale. The Norman Duke's success in assembling this massive expedition demonstrated both his diplomatic acumen and his understanding that the conquest of England would require forces far exceeding anything Normandy alone could provide. Beginning in early 1066, William's agents spread throughout continental Europe, recruiting knights, infantry and specialists from regions as distant as southern Italy and the German borderlands. The recruitment process centred on William's extensive network of political and familial connections developed during his decades of rule in Normandy. His marriage to Matilda of Flanders provided direct access to Flemish military resources, while his diplomatic relationships with neighbouring French nobles opened additional recruitment opportunities. The papal blessing for his expedition proved particularly valuable in attracting volunteers from across Catholic Europe, as many knights viewed participation as a form of armed pilgrimage that would earn spiritual rewards while offering prospects for temporal advancement. Flemish contingents formed the largest non-Norman component of William's invasion force, reflecting both the duchy's military capabilities and Count Baldwin V's complex position regarding the English succession. Baldwin's relationship with Harold Godwinson through his daughter Judith's marriage created potential conflicts of interest, yet the Count ultimately supported his son-in-law William's claim while maintaining careful neutrality in official diplomatic communications. Flemish knights brought particular expertise in siege warfare and possessed well-maintained equipment that complemented Norman cavalry traditions. The Breton contribution to William's army reflected the complex political relationships within the Celtic regions of northwestern France. Duke Alan IV of Brittany provided substantial forces while pursuing his own territorial ambitions, viewing the English expedition as an opportunity to expand Breton influence and secure new lands for his followers. Breton military traditions emphasized infantry combat and naval operations, skills that proved essential for the amphibious nature of William's planned invasion. The integration of Breton forces required careful diplomatic management, as their commanders maintained significant independence and expected substantial rewards for their participation. French nobles from regions throughout the kingdom contributed forces to William's expedition, motivated by combinations of feudal obligation, religious conviction, and personal ambition. The participation of knights from Anjou, Maine, Poitou, and other French territories transformed the invasion from a Norman enterprise into a broader European venture. These diverse contingents brought varying military traditions, equipment standards, and tactical preferences that required coordination through William's command structure. The most exotic participants in William's expedition came from Norman territories in southern Italy, where descendants of earlier Norman adventurers had established powerful principalities through military conquest. These southern Norman contingents brought experience from campaigns against Byzantine forces and Muslim armies, providing tactical knowledge unavailable to their northern counterparts. Their participation demonstrated the extent of Norman networks throughout Europe and the appeal of William's cause among professional military communities. The construction of William's invasion fleet at Dives-sur-Mer represented an engineering achievement that strained the resources of medieval shipbuilding technology. The Norman coast possessed limited facilities for constructing vessels of the size and number required for transporting approximately 7,000 men, 3,000 horses, and massive quantities of supplies across the English Channel. William's shipwrights drew upon Scandinavian shipbuilding traditions inherited from the duchy's Viking origins, while incorporating innovations developed through Mediterranean trade connections. The fleet's composition included various vessel types designed for specific functions within the invasion plan. Large transport ships, capable of carrying 30 to 40 men along with their equipment and horses, formed the backbone of the fleet. These vessels required sophisticated loading systems to accommodate cavalry mounts, as horses presented particular challenges for medieval naval transport. Specialized horse transports featured reinforced decks, ventilation systems, and feeding arrangements necessary for maintaining cavalry effectiveness during the crossing. Smaller vessels provided reconnaissance capabilities and tactical flexibility during the invasion. Fast galleys equipped with experienced crews could scout English coastal defences, maintain communication between fleet elements, and provide escort services for the larger transport vessels. The integration of these different ship types required careful coordination to ensure the fleet moved as a cohesive unit while maintaining the ability to respond to changing tactical situations. The provisioning requirements for William's expedition demanded systematic planning that extended far beyond simple food supplies. Each soldier required weapons, armour, personal equipment, and specialised tools for campaign operations. Cavalry forces needed additional supplies, including horse armour, veterinary equipment, and fodder sufficient for extended operations in potentially hostile territory. The logistics of maintaining these supplies during the pre-invasion period, while ensuring their protection during the Channel crossing, presented unprecedented challenges. Food preservation techniques of the 11th century limited the types of supplies that could sustain extended campaigns. Salted meat, dried fish, hard cheese, and preserved grains formed the basis of military provisions, supplemented by wine and ale for maintaining morale and preventing disease. The quantities required for feeding thousands of men and horses during the invasion and subsequent campaign operations strained Norman agricultural production and required extensive purchasing from neighbouring regions. The concentration of forces at Dives-sur-Mer created massive logistical challenges that tested William's administrative capabilities. Housing thousands of soldiers while maintaining discipline and preventing conflicts between different national contingents required sophisticated camp organisation and clear command hierarchies. The prolonged assembly period allowed for training and coordination between diverse military units, but also created opportunities for desertion, disease, and resource depletion that threatened the expedition's viability. The military organisation of William's invasion force reflected both Norman feudal traditions and the practical requirements of commanding a multinational army. The the Duke maintained direct command over Norman contingents while delegating authority over foreign units to their traditional leaders, creating a complex command structure that balanced feudal obligations with tactical efficiency. This arrangement required constant negotiation and diplomacy to maintain unity while ensuring effective battlefield coordination. Norman cavalry formed the expedition's elite striking force, comprising approximately 2,000 heavily armed knights equipped with the finest armour and weapons available in 11th century Europe. These knights represented the culmination of Norman military development, combining Scandinavian warrior traditions with Frankish feudal organisation and the latest innovations in metallurgy and horse breeding. Their training emphasised coordinated charge tactics that could break enemy formations through concentrated impact. The infantry components of William's army included professional soldiers, feudal levies, and mercenary units recruited throughout Europe. Norman infantry specialised in supporting cavalry operations, while maintaining independent combat capabilities when circumstances required. Their equipment included spears, swords, axes and crossbows, with armour ranging from simple leather protection to sophisticated mail hauberks, depending on individual resources and military status. Flemish crossbow units provided specialised missile capabilities that complemented traditional Norman archery. The crossbow's mechanical advantage allowed less trained soldiers to achieve accuracy and penetration superior to conventional bows, though at the cost of reduced firing rates. The integration of crossbow tactics with cavalry operations required extensive training and coordination to maximise effectiveness while avoiding friendly fire incidents. Engineering specialists within William's army included siege experts, bridge builders, and fortification engineers whose skills would prove essential for reducing English strongholds. These specialists brought tools and knowledge necessary for constructing siege engines, undermining walls, and establishing temporary fortifications during campaign operations. Their presence indicated William's understanding that conquering England would require more than winning a single decisive battle. The delay caused by unfavourable winds during late summer 1066 created both challenges and opportunities that would ultimately influence the invasion's success. Contrary winds trapped William's fleet at Divers-sur-Mer for several weeks, forcing the Duke to maintain expensive military forces while facing increasing pressure from followers eager to return to their own territories. The extended delay strained financial resources and tested the loyalty of foreign contingents who had expected rapid action following their arrival. The meteorological factors affecting medieval naval operations reflected the limited understanding of weather patterns and the absence of reliable forecasting methods. Medieval commanders relied on traditional seasonal patterns, local knowledge, and religious guidance when planning maritime expeditions. The persistence of unfavourable winds during what should have been optimal sailing season created anxiety about divine disapproval while forcing practical adjustments to invasion timing. William's decision to relocate his fleet from Divers-sur-Mer to Saint-Valery-sur-Somme represented a strategic adaptation that demonstrated his flexibility in responding to changing circumstances. The new location offered superior harbour facilities and positioned the fleet closer to potential landing sites on the English coast. The relocation required complex logistical coordination to transport supplies, equipment, and personnel while maintaining operational security and preventing intelligence leaks to English forces. The delay's impact on English defensive preparations proved equally significant in determining the invasion's ultimate outcome. Harold Godwinson's forces had maintained positions along the southern coast throughout the summer, awaiting William's expected arrival while dealing with the economic and military challenges of extended mobilisation. The prolonged waiting period exhausted English resources and forced Harold to dismiss his militia forces just as the invasion threat materialised. The psychological effects of the delay tested both Norman and English resolve in different ways. William's followers began questioning divine support for their cause, while facing increasing financial hardship and homesickness. The Duke's leadership during this critical period required constant reassurance and material support to maintain army cohesion. His decision to open the reliquary of St. Valery and pray publicly for favourable winds demonstrated understanding of his followers' spiritual concerns, while reinforcing his own religious commitment to the expedition. Harold's defensive strategy during the delay period reflected the fundamental challenges facing medieval kingdoms when confronting invasion threats. The English king's decision to position his fleet at the Isle of Wight provided early warning capabilities while maintaining flexibility to respond to landings at various coastal locations. However, the extended mobilisation period strained English naval resources and forced difficult decisions about maintaining expensive defensive preparations. The arrival of favourable winds in late September 1066 found both armies in significantly different positions than they had occupied during the summer months. William's forces, despite the challenges of extended encampment, had achieved high levels of training and coordination that would prove decisive in subsequent operations. The multinational character of his army had evolved from a potential weakness into a source of tactical diversity and specialised capabilities. The final preparations for departure involved religious ceremonies that reinforced the expedition's sacred character while providing opportunities for final coordination between different contingents. William's public prayers and his display of papal relics reminded his followers of their divine mission, while demonstrating his own piety and commitment to church reform in England. These ceremonies served practical purposes by allowing final equipment checks and tactical briefings while maintaining army morale during the critical pre-invasion period. The loading procedures for the invasion fleet required precise coordination to ensure proper weight distribution and tactical deployment capabilities upon landing. Cavalry units needed to embark with their mounts in configurations that allowed rapid disembarkation and immediate combat readiness. Infantry formations required organisation that maintained unit integrity while maximising transport efficiency. The complexity of these arrangements reflected the sophisticated planning that characterised William's entire invasion enterprise. The autumn of 1066 opened with England facing the unprecedented challenge of simultaneous invasions from two formidable enemies, each commanding substantial military forces and possessing legitimate grievances against Harold Godwinson's rule. While William's fleet remained windbound at Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, Harold Hardrada had already begun mobilising his Norwegian forces for a northern assault that would exploit England's extended defensive commitments along the southern coast. The Norwegian king's decision to coordinate his invasion with Tostig Godwinson's intimate knowledge of English military dispositions created a strategic nightmare for Harold, whose resources could not adequately defend both potential landing zones simultaneously. Harold Hardrada's invasion force assembled in the Orkney Islands during late August 1066, combining Norwegian royal troops with Scottish auxiliaries provided by King Malcolm III and additional forces recruited from throughout Scandinavia. The Norwegian fleet comprised approximately 300 ships, representing one of the largest naval expeditions mounted from Scandinavia during the 11th century. These vessels transported roughly 9,000 warriors, including Hardrada's elite huscarls, regional levies from Norwegian provinces, and mercenary contingents attracted by promises of English plunder and land grants. The huscarls accompanying Hardrada represented the pinnacle of Scandinavian military development, professional warriors whose training and equipment rivaled the best heavy infantry in contemporary Europe. These men carried distinctive Danish axes capable of cleaving through mail armour and shields, while their own protection consisted of knee-length mail hauberks reinforced with iron plates at crucial points. Their shields, painted in traditional Norwegian patterns, measured nearly 4 feet in diameter and were constructed from limewood reinforced with iron bosses. The huscarls' tactical doctrine emphasised defensive formations that could withstand cavalry charges while maintaining offensive capabilities through coordinated axe attacks. Tostig Godwinson's presence within Hardrada's expedition provided crucial intelligence about English defensive preparations and potential landing sites along the Yorkshire coast. The exiled earl's knowledge of local geography, political loyalties and military resources allowed the Norwegian force to plan their approach with unprecedented precision. Tostig's supporters among the northern English nobility, while limited in number, provided essential reconnaissance information about Harold's troop dispositions and the readiness of local defensive forces. The Norwegian fleet's approach to the English coast followed traditional Viking raiding routes, utilising the Humber estuary as their primary avenue of penetration into Yorkshire. This waterway provided deep water access for their largest vessels, while offering multiple landing options depending on English defensive responses. The choice of the Humber also reflected strategic calculations about minimising exposure to English naval forces, which remained concentrated in southern waters awaiting William's expected invasion. The initial Norwegian landings at Rickel, approximately 10 miles south of York, encountered minimal resistance from local forces unprepared for such a massive invasion. The speed and scale of Hardrada's assault overwhelmed the limited English garrisons stationed along the Yorkshire coast, allowing the Norwegians to establish secure beachheads and begin advancing inland toward York, the administrative centre of northern England. The Norwegian advance proceeded methodically, with advance units securing river crossings and supply lines, while the main force maintained defensive positions protecting their fleet. Earl Edwin of Mercia and his brother Earl Morcar of Northumbria commanded the northern English forces responsible for defending against Scandinavian invasion. Their combined armies included approximately 4,000 men drawn from the feared levies of their respective earldoms, supplemented by professional warriors from their household troops. However, the sudden nature of Hardrada's assault and the dispersed positioning of English forces prevented effective concentration of defensive resources before the Norwegians established their foothold. The Battle of Fulford, fought on September 20th, 1066, demonstrated both the formidable nature of Norwegian military capabilities and the limitations of English defensive preparations in the north. The engagement occurred approximately 2 miles south of York, where Edwin and Morcar had positioned their forces to block further Norwegian advance toward the city. The battlefield consisted of relatively flat terrain intersected by drainage ditches and small streams that would influence tactical movements throughout the engagement. The English deployment reflected traditional Anglo-Saxon battle tactics, with the fyrd forming a shield wall anchored by the Earl's household troops and supported by archers positioned to disrupt enemy formations. Edwin commanded the Mercian contingent on the right wing, while Morcar led the Northumbrian forces on the left, with both earls maintaining central positions to coordinate their respective commands. The English position offered defensive advantages, utilising natural obstacles to channel Norwegian attacks while maintaining communication lines with York. Hardrada's tactical approach demonstrated the sophisticated military thinking that had made him one of Europe's most feared commanders. The Norwegian king deployed his forces in 3 distinct divisions, with his huscarls forming a central striking force supported by regional levies on both flanks. Tostig commanded a reserve formation positioned to exploit breakthrough opportunities or reinforce threatened sectors. The Norwegian formation emphasised flexibility and concentrated striking power, rather than the linear defensive approaches favoured by Anglo-Saxon commanders. The battle commenced with preliminary exchanges between opposing archer units, as both sides sought to disrupt enemy formations before committing to close combat. Norwegian archery proved particularly effective, utilising composite bows acquired during Hardrada's service in the Byzantine Empire that possessed superior range and penetration compared to traditional English longbows. The initial missile exchanges created casualties within English ranks, while forcing adjustments to their defensive positions. The decisive phase began when Hardrada launched his huscarls against the English centre, seeking to break through the shield wall at its strongest point and create panic within enemy ranks. The Norwegian assault demonstrated the effectiveness of their tactical training, with individual warriors coordinating their attacks to maximise the impact of their distinctive weapons. Danish axes proved devastatingly effective against English shields and armour, creating gaps in the defensive line that additional Norwegian forces could exploit. The collapse of the English centre triggered a general retreat that quickly transformed into a rout, with surviving English forces fleeing toward York while Norwegian pursuit units inflicted heavy casualties on the disorganised fugitives. Both Edwin and Morcar survived the engagement, though their armies suffered catastrophic losses that eliminated northern England's capacity for independent resistance. The defeat at Fulford left York defenceless and provided Hardrada with control over Yorkshire's administrative and economic resources. The Norwegian occupation of York required careful management to maintain local cooperation while extracting the resources necessary to sustain their invasion force. Hardrada's approach demonstrated sophisticated understanding of medieval administrative practices, utilising existing English governmental structures while installing Norwegian oversight to ensure compliance with his demands. The city's merchants and craftsmen found themselves compelled to provide supplies and services to their conquerors, while the ecclesiastical hierarchy faced pressure to recognise Norwegian authority. News of the Fulford disaster reached Harold Godwinson at his headquarters in London within days of the battle, forcing the English king to make crucial strategic decisions under extreme time pressure. The magnitude of the northern defeat and the immediate threat to York required rapid response, yet Harold's primary forces remained positioned along the southern coast, awaiting William's expected invasion. The king's decision to march north with his available forces represented a calculated gamble that William's continued delay would provide sufficient time to eliminate the Norwegian threat before returning to face the Norman invasion. Harold's forced march north with approximately 3,000 men represented one of the most remarkable military movements in medieval English history. The Royal Army covered the 185 miles between London and York in just 4 days, utilising the Roman road system and pre-positioned supply depots to maintain unprecedented marching speeds. This achievement required extraordinary physical endurance from the troops involved and demonstrated the effectiveness of English administrative systems in supporting rapid military movements. The composition of Harold's northern expedition reflected the urgency of the situation and the limited forces available for immediate deployment. The king's personal household troops formed the core of the army, supplemented by hastily assembled feared levies from the home counties and professional warriors from loyal, noble houses. The absence of substantial cavalry forces reflected both the speed requirements of the march and the tactical considerations involved in confronting Norwegian infantry formations. Harold's strategic approach to the northern campaign demonstrated sophisticated military thinking adapted to the specific challenges posed by Hardrada's invasion. Rather than attempting to besiege the Norwegians within York, the English king sought to draw them into open battle where English mobility and local knowledge could offset Norwegian advantages in equipment and training. Harold's agents within York provided intelligence about Norwegian dispositions and intentions, while preparing local supporters for coordinated action during the anticipated battle. The negotiations at Stamford Bridge revealed the complex diplomatic dimensions underlying the military conflict. Hardrada's agreement to meet Harold at the bridge site, approximately 7 miles northeast of York, reflected confidence in Norwegian military superiority while providing opportunities for political resolution that might avoid costly battle. The location offered tactical advantages for both armies, with the bridge itself serving as a natural choke point that could influence battle outcomes. The preliminary discussions between the opposing commanders involved ritualized exchanges that reflected medieval concepts of honour and legitimate authority. Harold's offer to grant Tostig his former earldom in exchange for abandoning the Norwegian alliance demonstrated understanding of the personal motivations underlying the invasion while attempting to divide enemy leadership. Hardrada's rejection of English terms reflected both his confidence in military victory and his commitment to broader territorial ambitions in northern England. The Battle of Stamford Bridge on September the 25th, 1066, opened with the Norwegian forces positioned on the eastern side of the River Derwent. Having crossed the bridge earlier to establish defensive positions on favourable terrain, Hardrada's deployment reflected expectations of a conventional engagement, with his forces arranged in traditional battle order, but without the heavy armour and weapons that remained with their ships at recall. The unexpectedly warm weather had prompted many Norwegian warriors to leave their mail hauberks behind, a decision that would prove fatal when Harold's attack materialised with surprising speed and intensity. The English assault began with a coordinated attack across the narrow bridge, where legend records a single Norwegian warrior holding the crossing against multiple English attackers until finally being killed by a spear thrust from below the bridge. While the historical accuracy of this specific incident remains questionable, the tactical reality of forcing a defended river crossing required exceptional courage and coordination from Harold's advance units. The successful bridge assault allowed English forces to deploy on the eastern bank and engage the main Norwegian army. The battle's decisive phase demonstrated the effectiveness of Harold's tactical innovations and the vulnerability of lightly armoured Norwegian forces to sustained English attacks. The English assault combined traditional shield wall tactics with more flexible formations that could exploit gaps in enemy lines and maintain pressure across multiple points. Harold's personal leadership during the engagement inspired his troops while providing tactical coordination that maximised their combat effectiveness. Hardrada's death during the battle eliminated Norwegian command cohesion and triggered the collapse of organised resistance. The Norwegian king's fall, reportedly from an arrow wound to the throat, created immediate succession questions within the invasion force while removing the charismatic leadership that had held the multinational army together. Tostig's death shortly afterward eliminated the last significant Norwegian leader capable of maintaining resistance. The English victory at Stamford Bridge achieved complete tactical success, with Norwegian casualties estimated at over 6,000 men, including most of their professional warriors and leadership cadre. The magnitude of Norwegian losses effectively ended Scandinavian ambitions for conquering England, while eliminating a major threat to Harold's rule. The surviving Norwegians, led by Hardrada's son Olaf, negotiated terms that allowed their departure from England with the understanding that they would not return as invaders. The immediate aftermath of Stamford Bridge required Harold to manage both the consequences of victory and preparation for the anticipated Norman invasion. The king's decision to allow Norwegian survivors to depart rather than pursuing complete annihilation reflected both practical considerations about conserving English strength and diplomatic calculations about preventing future Scandinavian hostility. The generous terms granted to Olaf and his remaining forces demonstrated Harold's understanding of broader strategic implications beyond the immediate military situation. The celebration following the Stamford Bridge victory proved brief, as messengers arrived bearing news of William's landing at Pevensey on September 28, just 3 days after the Northern Battle. This intelligence forced Harold to make immediate decisions about redeploying his exhausted forces for a second major campaign, while managing the administrative requirements of securing Yorkshire against potential Norwegian return. The timing of William's invasion, whether coordinated with Norwegian operations or merely coincidental, created the worst possible strategic situation for English defensive capabilities. Harold's forced march south represented an even more demanding military movement than his earlier northern expedition. The English army, already exhausted from the rapid advance to Yorkshire and the intense combat at Stamford Bridge, faced the prospect of covering 250 miles to reach the threatened southern coast. The king's decision to undertake this movement with his existing forces rather than waiting for fresh troops reflected both the urgency of the Norman threat and confidence in his veterans' capabilities despite their recent exertions. The strategic implications of fighting two major battles within weeks created unprecedented challenges for medieval military logistics and troop morale. Harold's forces had suffered casualties at Stamford Bridge that reduced their overall strength, while the survivors faced psychological and physical exhaustion that would influence their effectiveness in subsequent combat. The king's ability to maintain army cohesion during the Southern March demonstrated both his personal leadership qualities and the loyalty of English forces to their monarch. The intelligence regarding William's landing provided crucial information about Norman dispositions and immediate intentions. English agents reported that the Norman forces had established fortified positions around Pevensey and Hastings, while conducting foraging operations throughout the surrounding countryside. William's decision to remain near his landing sites rather than advancing immediately toward London suggested either caution about English defensive capabilities or strategic calculations about forcing Harold to attack Norman positions on ground of William's choosing. Harold's exhausted army reached the outskirts of London on October 6, 1066, having completed their gruelling march from Yorkshire in just 11 days. The king's forces, numbering approximately 2,500 men after casualties and stragglers from the northern campaign, represented the core of English military strength, but bore visible signs of their recent exertions. Many warriors limped from foot injuries sustained during the forced marches, while others displayed bandaged wounds from Stamford Bridge that had not fully healed. Their equipment showed similar wear, with dented helmets, notched sword blades, and shields bearing fresh scars from Norwegian axes serving as testament to their recent victory. The strategic situation confronting Harold upon his return to London demanded immediate decisions about deployment, reinforcement, and tactical approach to the Norman threat. William's forces had established themselves in a triangular defensive zone anchored by fortifications at Pevensey, Hastings, and a newly constructed earthwork castle at the latter location. Norman foraging parties operated throughout East Sussex, systematically stripping the countryside of supplies while gathering intelligence about English defensive preparations. These operations served dual purposes of sustaining William's army and provoking Harold into premature action by devastating lands belonging to the English king's supporters. The Norman construction of a Motte and Bailey fortification at Hastings demonstrated William's understanding of siege warfare and his intention to maintain secure bases regardless of battlefield outcomes. The earthwork castle, built within days of the landing using impressed local labour, consisted of an artificial mound approximately 30 feet high, topped by a wooden palisade and tower. The bailey, or lower courtyard, contained stables, workshops, and storage facilities protected by earthen ramparts and timber walls. This fortification provided refuge for Norman forces if initial battles proved unsuccessful, while serving as a supply depot and administrative centre for the occupied territory. Harold's decision to advance directly toward the Norman positions, rather than waiting for additional reinforcements, reflected both strategic calculations and personal motivations that would prove decisive in determining the campaign's outcome. The king's military advisers, including his brothers Gurth and Leofwine, advocated for delaying action until fresh feared levies could arrive from the northern counties and the Midlands. These reinforcements, numbering potentially 4,000 additional men, could have provided Harold with substantial numerical superiority and reduced the burden on his exhausted veterans. The English king's rejection of this cautious approach stemmed from multiple factors that demonstrated both political acumen and strategic miscalculation. Harold recognised that prolonged Norman occupation of Sussex would allow William to consolidate his position, construct additional fortifications, and potentially receive reinforcements from continental supporters. The devastation being inflicted on English territories by Norman foraging operations created pressure from local nobles demanding immediate action to protect their land's independence. Additionally, Harold's recent victory at Stamford Bridge had generated confidence in his tactical abilities and the fighting qualities of his core troops. The composition of Harold's army as it advanced towards Sussex reflected the hasty nature of English mobilisation and the limited time available for proper organisation. The king's household troops, numbering approximately 800 men, formed the professional core of the force and included the finest warriors in England. These Huscarls carried weapons and armour comparable to their Norman counterparts, with many possessing Danish axes inherited from earlier Scandinavian influences on English military culture. Their mail hauberks, often reaching to mid-thigh, provided protection superior to most contemporary European infantry, while their shields bore the distinctive designs of their respective lords. The feared contingents accompanying Harold represented a mixture of well-equipped thanes and lesser-armed peasant levies whose military value varied considerably depending on their regional origins and recent combat experience. The London Fyrd included skilled craftsmen and merchants whose prosperity allowed them to purchase quality weapons and armour, making them formidable opponents despite their part-time military status. Rural levies from Kent and Surrey brought agricultural tools adapted for warfare alongside traditional spears and shields, reflecting the improvised nature of their mobilisation. The English advance toward Hastings proceeded along the ancient trackway known as the London Lewis Road, which provided the most direct route to the Norman positions while offering opportunities for tactical deployment once the armies made contact. Harold's scouts reported that William's forces remained concentrated around their coastal bases, conducting daily foraging expeditions, but showing no immediate intention of advancing toward London. This intelligence suggested that the Norman Duke preferred to fight a defensive battle on terrain of his choosing, rather than risk his forces in unfamiliar territory. The selection of Culdbeck Hill as Harold's assembly point demonstrated sophisticated understanding of local geography and tactical requirements. This elevated position, located approximately 7 miles northwest of Hastings, provided commanding views of the surrounding countryside, while offering multiple deployment options depending on Norman responses to English movements. The hill's slopes could accommodate Harold's entire army, while providing natural defensive advantages should William choose to attack English positions. William's intelligence network, maintained through local informants and Norman reconnaissance patrols, provided regular updates on English movements and dispositions. The Duke's agents reported Harold's arrival at Coldbeck Hill during the evening of October 13th, along with estimates of English strength and the apparent exhaustion of many troops. This information allowed William to finalise his battle plans and issue tactical instructions to his diverse army components during the night preceding the engagement. The Norman army that prepared for battle on October 14th represented the culmination of months of careful recruitment and organisation. William's forces totalled approximately 7,000 men divided into distinct national contingents, each maintaining their traditional fighting methods while operating within an overall tactical framework developed through extensive training during the pre-invasion period. The Norman contingent, numbering roughly 3,000 men, formed the army's core and included William's most trusted commanders and elite cavalry units. The Breton forces under Count Alan Fergant occupied the left wing of William's battle line and brought distinctive Celtic military traditions that emphasised mobility and individual combat prowess. Breton knights rode smaller, more agile horses than their Norman counterparts, and carried lighter equipment that facilitated rapid manoeuvring. Their infantry included experienced warriors armed with javelins and long swords, who specialised in supporting cavalry operations through coordinated attacks on enemy flanks. Flemish and French contingents formed the army's right wing under the command of Eustace of Boulogne, whose political connections throughout northern France had facilitated recruitment of substantial forces. These troops included some of Europe's most heavily armoured cavalry, with knights wearing full mail hauberks reinforced with additional protection at vital points. Their horses, bred specifically for warfare, possessed the size and strength necessary to carry armoured riders through sustained combat operations. The tactical deployment of William's army on the morning of October 14th reflected careful consideration of terrain features and enemy capabilities. The Norman position occupied the southern slope of Telham Hill, approximately 1 mile south of the English positions on Senlac Ridge. This deployment provided clear fields of fire for Norman archers, while allowing cavalry units sufficient space for forming and executing charge formations. The gentle slope between the opposing armies offered ideal conditions for mounted warfare, while presenting obstacles for English infantry attempting to maintain formation integrity during any advance. The Norman battle line extended approximately 800 yards across the valley floor, with each national contingent maintaining distinct positions while coordinating their movements through pre-arranged signals and command structures. William positioned himself with a Norman centre, where his personal banner and the papal standard provided visible rallying points for his diverse forces. The Duke's command position allowed him to observe battlefield developments while remaining accessible to messengers carrying reports from different sectors. Harold's deployment on Senlac Ridge demonstrated traditional Anglo-Saxon defensive tactics adapted to the specific challenges posed by Norman cavalry. The English position stretched along the ridge's crest for approximately 600 yards, utilising natural obstacles including fallen trees and marshy ground to channel enemy attacks into predetermined killing zones. The famous shield wall formation that would characterise the battle's opening phases required precise coordination between individual warriors to maintain effectiveness against sustained assault. The English battle line consisted of Harold's household troops occupying the centre around the royal standard, with feared levies extending the formation toward both flanks. The king's brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, commanded the left and right wings respectively, maintaining communication with Harold through runners positioned at regular intervals along the line. The English formation emphasised depth rather than width, with multiple ranks of warriors prepared to replace casualties and maintain defensive integrity throughout extended combat. The morning hours of October 14th witnessed final preparations as both armies completed their deployments and commanders issued last-minute instructions to their respective forces. William's address to his troops emphasised their divine mission and the righteousness of their cause, while Harold's speeches focused on defending English soil against foreign invaders. These motivational efforts reflected the psychological dimensions of medieval warfare, where morale and unit cohesion often determined outcomes more decisively than tactical superiority. The battle commenced at approximately 9 a.m. with a Norman archery barrage directed against English positions along the ridge. The initial volleys involved roughly 1,000 archers shooting at maximum range to disrupt English formations and create casualties before the main assault began. Norman arrows, fired from composite bows acquired through Mediterranean trade connections, possessed superior range and penetration compared to traditional English weapons, though the uphill trajectory reduced their effectiveness against well-protected targets. The English response to the archery attack demonstrated the effectiveness of their defensive preparations and the quality of their equipment. Most arrows struck English shields or mail armour without causing serious casualties, while the shield wall formation provided mutual protection that minimised the psychological impact of the missile barrage. Some English archers returned fire from positions behind the main battle line, though their smaller numbers and inferior weapons limited their effectiveness against Norman formations. The failure of the initial archery attack prompted William to order the first infantry assault against English positions at approximately 9:30 a.m. Norman foot soldiers, supported by Breton and Flemish contingents, advanced up the slope in coordinated formations designed to create gaps in the English shield wall through concentrated pressure at specific points. These infantry carried spears, swords, and axes similar to English weapons, though their tactical doctrine emphasised offensive action rather than the defensive approaches favoured by Anglo-Saxon forces. The English defence against the first Norman assault showcased the formidable nature of the shield wall when properly maintained by experienced warriors. Harold's household troops absorbed the initial impact through coordinated movements that distributed attacking pressure across multiple defenders. while their long-handled axes proved devastatingly effective against Norman shields and armour. The psychological effect of facing these distinctive weapons, capable of cleaving through mail and severing limbs, created hesitation among attacking forces that reduced the momentum of their assault. The repulse of the first Norman infantry attack occurred around 10 a.m, with attacking forces withdrawing down the slope after failing to create significant breaches in English defences. Norman casualties during this phase included several prominent knights and substantial numbers of infantry, though English losses remained relatively light due to their defensive advantages. The failure of the initial assault created doubts among some Norman contingents about their ability to overcome English defensive positions through direct attack. William's response to the setback demonstrated the tactical flexibility that characterised his military leadership throughout his career. Rather than ordering immediate renewed infantry assaults, the Duke deployed his cavalry forces in coordinated attacks designed to exploit specific weaknesses in English defensive arrangements. The Norman cavalry charge that commenced at approximately 10:15 a.m. represented one of the most significant tactical developments in medieval European warfare, combining traditional shock tactics with innovative coordination techniques. The first major cavalry assault targeted the English left wing, where Breton forces under Alan Fergant executed a coordinated charge involving approximately 500 mounted warriors. The attackers approached at full gallop in wedge formations designed to concentrate maximum impact at specific points along the English line. Their lances, measuring 12 feet in length and equipped with steel points, provided reach advantages that allowed mounted warriors to strike English defenders before coming within range of their weapons. The English response to the cavalry charge revealed both strengths and weaknesses in their defensive system. The shield wall absorbed much of the initial impact through coordinated resistance, with individual warriors supporting their neighbours against mounted attackers. However, the psychological pressure of facing charging horses created gaps in English formations that experienced Norman knights could exploit. Several breakthrough attempts succeeded in penetrating the English line, though quick reactions by reserve forces contained these incursions before they could expand into general collapse. The most significant development during the first cavalry assault occurred when rumours spread through Breton ranks that William had been killed, causing a general retreat that quickly transformed into panic among the left-wing forces. The Duke's apparent death created immediate succession questions while removing the charismatic leadership that held the multinational army together. Some English forces, particularly feared Levers on their right wing, broke formation to pursue the retreating Bretons, abandoning their defensive positions in expectation of complete Norman collapse. William's dramatic appearance on the battlefield, removing his helmet to show his face while shouting that he remained alive and would achieve victory, represented one of medieval warfare's most crucial leadership moments. The Duke's personal intervention halted the Breton retreat while inspiring renewed confidence among his diverse forces. His decision to personally lead a counterattack against the pursuing English demonstrated both physical courage and tactical understanding of the critical moment's requirements. The destruction of the English pursuers marked the battle's first decisive tactical development and demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated Norman responses to changing battlefield conditions. William's cavalry counterattack trapped approximately 400 English warriors who had abandoned their defensive positions, inflicting heavy casualties while eliminating experienced fighters from Harold's army. This success provided Norman forces with their first clear victory, while revealing vulnerabilities in English tactical discipline. The feigned retreat that followed this accidental success represented deliberate tactical innovation that would characterise the battle's middle phases. Norman commanders, recognising that English warriors would abandon defensive positions when presented with apparent victory opportunities, developed coordinated withdrawal movements designed to draw enemy forces into vulnerable positions. These tactical retreats required exceptional discipline and coordination to execute effectively while maintaining the ability to counterattack pursuing forces. The execution of the first deliberate feigned retreat commenced at approximately 11:30 am, with Flemish cavalry on the Norman right wing conducting a carefully orchestrated withdrawal that appeared genuine to English observers. The retreating forces maintained formation integrity while creating the impression of panic and defeat that would encourage English pursuit. Prepositioned Norman reserves prepared to exploit any English forces that abandoned their defensive positions in response to the apparent Flemish collapse. The English reaction to the Flemish retreat revealed the continuing effectiveness of Harold's command structure and the discipline of his experienced troops. The king's household warriors maintained their positions despite the apparent opportunity for pursuit, recognizing the tactical risks involved in abandoning defensive advantages. However, some feared contingents, particularly those from Kent and Surrey who had arrived most recently, proved susceptible to the temptation of pursuing apparently defeated enemies. The Norman counterattack against the second group of English pursuers achieved results similar to the earlier success, though on a smaller scale due to Harold's efforts to maintain formation discipline. Approximately 200 English warriors fell victim to the coordinated cavalry assault, reducing Harold's effective strength while demonstrating the continued effectiveness of Norman tactical innovations. The cumulative effect of these losses began to create gaps in English defensive positions that would influence subsequent phases of the engagement. The midday period of the battle, lasting from approximately 12 p.m. to 2 p.m, witnessed repeated cycles of Norman assault and English defence that gradually wore down both armies while failing to achieve decisive results for either side. William's forces launched multiple coordinated attacks combining archery, infantry and cavalry elements in attempts to create breakthrough opportunities. These assaults demonstrated increasing sophistication in inter-unit coordination, while revealing the stubborn effectiveness of English defensive tactics when properly maintained. Harold's forces during this period showed remarkable resilience despite mounting casualties and psychological pressure from sustained Norman attacks. The English shield wall contracted gradually as losses accumulated, but maintained structural integrity through the disciplined replacement of casualties and the redistribution of remaining forces. The king's personal leadership remained crucial in maintaining morale, with Harold moving constantly along his battle line to encourage defenders and coordinate responses to Norman tactical innovations. The attrition warfare that characterized the battle's middle phases created mounting pressure on both armies' logistical and medical capabilities. Norman forces faced increasing difficulties in maintaining attack momentum as casualties accumulated among their cavalry horses and experienced knights. English defenders struggled with ammunition shortages for their archers, while dealing with growing numbers of wounded warriors who required evacuation from forward positions. The afternoon phase of the battle opened with William's decision to concentrate his remaining forces for a final decisive assault against English positions. The Norman Duke recognised that his army's diverse contingents were approaching exhaustion, while English defensive capabilities remained formidable despite accumulated losses. The planned assault would combine all available Norman tactical elements in coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm English resistance through concentrated pressure at multiple points. The final Norman archery barrage, commencing at approximately 2:30 p.m, represented the most intensive missile attack of the entire engagement. William ordered his remaining archers to concentrate their fire on the English centre around Harold's position, seeking to create casualties among the royal household troops whose leadership maintained overall defensive cohesion. The high-angle trajectory of these arrows, fired to clear English shields and strike defenders from above, proved more effective than earlier direct-fire attempts. The critical moment arrived when one of these high-trajectory arrows struck Harold in or near his right eye, creating the wound that would prove fatal and eliminate English command leadership at the battle's crucial phase. Contemporary accounts differ regarding the exact nature of Harold's injury, with some sources describing an arrow wound to the eye, while others suggest facial wounds caused by multiple projectiles. The specific details matter less than the immediate impact on English morale and command structure as news of the king's injury spread through their ranks. The final Norman cavalry assault, launched while English forces reeled from news of Harold's wounding, achieved the breakthrough that had eluded earlier attacks. William personally led approximately 1,000 remaining cavalry in a coordinated charge against the English centre, where gaps had appeared following the loss of royal leadership and the evacuation of wounded warriors. The psychological impact of the king's injury, combined with physical exhaustion from hours of combat, finally overwhelmed English defensive capabilities. The collapse of English resistance occurred rapidly once Norman cavalry penetrated their defensive line around 4 p.m. Harold's death, whether from his initial arrow wound or subsequent injuries inflicted during the final assault, eliminated any possibility of organised English retreat or regrouping. His brothers Gurth and Leofwine fell defending the royal standard, while most household troops died in place rather than abandoning their positions. The feared levies, lacking experienced leadership and facing overwhelming Norman pressure, finally broke and fled toward the surrounding forests. The Norman pursuit of fleeing English forces continued until darkness made further operations impossible, with William's cavalry ranging throughout the surrounding countryside to prevent English regrouping and eliminate potential centres of resistance. The battlefield itself revealed the engagement's intensity, with contemporary estimates suggesting English casualties of approximately 4,000 men, including most of Harold's experienced warriors. Norman losses, while substantial, totaled roughly 2,000 men and included many of William's most trusted commanders. The immediate aftermath of the battle required William to secure the battlefield while managing his own army's exhaustion and casualties. The Duke's first priority involved locating Harold's body among the thousands of corpses scattered across Senlac Ridge, a task complicated by the mutilation many bodies had suffered during the day's fighting. The identification of the English king's remains required examination by individuals familiar with Harold's physical appearance, ultimately confirmed through distinctive markings and the testimony of his former mistress, Edith Swanneck. The treatment of Harold's body became a matter of significant political and religious controversy that reflected broader questions about the legitimacy of William's conquest. English sources later claimed that William initially refused proper burial for Harold, ordering the body to be interred beneath a pile of stones on the seashore as punishment for his alleged perjury. Norman accounts suggested more respectful treatment, with some sources indicating that Harold received Christian burial at Waltham Abbey, a religious foundation he had personally established and supported. The disposal of other English casualties followed medieval practices that reflected both practical necessities and religious obligations. The battlefield's thousands of corpses required rapid burial to prevent disease, while providing appropriate Christian rites for the dead. William's chaplains supervised mass burial ceremonies, while Norman soldiers stripped valuable equipment from English bodies, a customary practice that helped offset campaign costs while providing rewards for surviving warriors. The strategic implications of Hastings extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory, as William's success eliminated organised English resistance while providing him with the momentum necessary for advancing toward London. The death of Harold and his brothers removed the Godwinson family's leadership, while casualties among the household troops eliminated England's most experienced military commanders. The battle's outcome ensured that subsequent English resistance would lack both coordination and professional military leadership. The Norman victory at Hastings had eliminated England's established military leadership, but William understood that battlefield success alone would not secure his conquest of an entire kingdom. The scattered English forces retreating from Senlac Ridge represented only a fraction of the realm's potential resistance, while the surviving Anglo-Saxon nobility retained substantial resources and territorial control throughout vast regions that had never witnessed Norman soldiers. The Duke's immediate challenge involved transforming his tactical victory into strategic dominance over a hostile population that outnumbered his forces by perhaps 50-1. William's initial advance toward London proceeded with calculated deliberation, rather than the rapid pursuit that might have been expected following such a decisive victory. The Norman army, reduced to approximately 5,000 effective troops after casualties and the need to garrison captured positions, moved eastward along the coast to secure Dover, whose strategic importance as a channel port made its capture essential for maintaining communications with Normandy. The fortress at Dover, perched on its commanding chalk cliffs, surrendered without resistance when its Anglo-Saxon garrison recognised the futility of prolonged defence against William's siege capabilities. The submission of Dover provided William with his first significant administrative challenge, as the town's population included substantial numbers of English nobles, clergy and merchants, whose cooperation would prove essential for establishing effective Norman governance. The Duke's approach to these potential collaborators demonstrated sophisticated understanding of conquest politics, combining displays of Norman military strength with carefully calibrated offers of continued privileges for those willing to accept his authority. The cathedral clergy at Dover received particular attention, as their influence extended throughout Kent, and their endorsement could legitimise Norman rule among the broader population. From Dover, William's forces advanced inland toward Canterbury, the ecclesiastical centre of English Christianity and the seat of Archbishop Stigand, whose irregular canonical status had provided one of the papal justifications for the Norman invasion. The city's surrender occurred without military action, though the circumstances revealed the complex political calculations that would characterise Norman expansion throughout England. Archbishop Stigand's submission to William carried enormous symbolic weight, as his recognition of Norman authority effectively transferred ecclesiastical legitimacy from the defeated Anglo-Saxon regime to the new Norman administration. The political ramifications of Canterbury's submission extended far beyond Kent, as news of the Archbishop's capitulation spread throughout England via the extensive network of religious houses and ecclesiastical communications. Monastery chronicles from this period document the profound shock experienced by Anglo-Saxon religious communities as they grappled with the implications of their spiritual leaders' acceptance of foreign rule. Many abbots and bishops faced agonising decisions about whether to follow Stigand's example or maintain resistance to Norman authority at the risk of violent suppression. Winchester's surrender to Norman forces in late October 1066 demonstrated the collapsing resistance of traditional Anglo-Saxon power structures throughout southern England. The ancient capital of Wessex, with its royal treasury and administrative records, represented perhaps the most significant prize available to William short of London itself. Queen Edith, Harold's sister and widow of Edward the Confessor, personally negotiated the city's submission while securing guarantees for the safety of its inhabitants and the preservation of royal properties under Norman protection. The transfer of Winchester's royal treasury to Norman control provided William with both the financial resources necessary for sustaining his campaign and tangible symbols of English royal authority that could legitimise his rule. The ceremonial regalia, official seals, and administrative documents captured at Winchester enabled Norman administrators to maintain governmental continuity while gradually replacing Anglo-Saxon personnel with trusted Norman appointees. The psychological impact of controlling these symbols of English kingship proved equally valuable, as their possession reinforced William's claims to legitimate succession from Edward the Confessor. The northern approach to London required William to navigate complex political terrain, where competing English factions maintained different attitudes toward Norman conquest. Edgar the Etheling, grandson of Edmund Ironside and the last surviving male member of the traditional Anglo-Saxon royal house, had been proclaimed king by surviving English nobles following news of Harold's death. However, Edgar's youth and the absence of experienced military commanders left this alternative English government without effective means of resistance against Norman advancement. The English nobility's support for Edgar the Etheling reflected both genuine commitment to Anglo-Saxon dynastic traditions and practical calculations about negotiating favourable terms with Norman conquerors. Earls Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, survivors of the Fulford disaster, recognised that their continued authority depended on demonstrating their value as intermediaries between Norman administrators and their regional populations. Their nominal support for Edgar provided them with bargaining positions, while avoiding premature submission that might appear as betrayal to their followers. Archbishop Ealdred of York emerged as the most significant ecclesiastical figure supporting Edgar's claim, though his motivations combined religious conviction with political pragmatism. Ealdred's position as the Northern Church's leader made his support crucial for any English resistance movement, while his extensive administrative experience offered practical governance capabilities that Edgar's faction otherwise lacked. The Archbishop's theological training also provided intellectual frameworks for justifying continued resistance to Norman rule, despite the papal blessing that William carried. William's strategic response to the Edgar faction involved a combination of military pressure and diplomatic inducements designed to fragment English opposition without requiring costly siege operations against London's formidable defences. The Norman advance proceeded along multiple routes that demonstrated William's capability to threaten the capital from various directions while avoiding direct assault against prepared defensive positions. This approach forced English leaders to divide their limited military resources while creating opportunities for individual negotiations with potential defectors. The devastation of the Thames Valley during William's approach to London represented the first systematic implementation of the terror tactics that would characterise Norman conquest methods throughout England. Norman foraging parties, operating under direct ducal authorisation, stripped entire villages of food supplies, livestock, and portable wealth while burning buildings and infrastructure that could support English resistance. These operations served multiple purposes: sustaining William's army, denying resources to English forces, and demonstrating the consequences of continued opposition to Norman authority. The psychological impact of this systematic destruction extended far beyond its immediate material effects, as English populations throughout the Thames Valley witnessed the apparent inability of their traditional leaders to protect them from foreign depredation. Village communities that had existed for centuries found themselves facing starvation and homelessness as Norman soldiers methodically eliminated their economic foundations. The refugee streams created by these operations carried news of Norman capabilities throughout southern England, while undermining confidence in English resistance movements. The Siege of London never materialised as a conventional military operation, as William's encirclement strategy created conditions that made prolonged defence impossible for the English leadership. The Norman occupation of strategic positions around the capital effectively cut communication lines between Edgar's government and potential supporters in the northern counties, while the continuing devastation of surrounding territories eliminated local resources necessary for sustaining a large defensive garrison. The psychological pressure of isolation, combined with the visible evidence of Norman military superiority, gradually eroded English resolve. The negotiations that led to London's submission revealed the complex personal and political calculations that influenced individual English nobles during this critical period. Earl Edwin and Earl Morcar, recognising that continued resistance offered little prospect of success while carrying enormous risks for their regional populations, initiated secret communications with Norman representatives regarding terms for their submission. These discussions required delicate balancing between their obligations to Edgar the Aetheling and their responsibilities as regional leaders, whose decisions would affect thousands of dependents. Archbishop Eldred's role in facilitating English submission demonstrated the crucial importance of ecclesiastical authority in legitimising political transitions during medieval succession crises. The Archbishop's theological expertise provided religious justifications for accepting Norman rule, particularly emphasising the papal blessing that William carried and the divine judgment apparently rendered at Hastings. Ealdred's willingness to crown William as king offered the new regime ecclesiastical legitimacy while protecting the English church from potential Norman retaliation. The formal submission ceremony that occurred at Berkhamsted in early December 1066 marked the effective end of organised English resistance to Norman conquest, though the event's carefully orchestrated nature reflected the political compromises necessary to achieve this outcome. Edgar the Aetheling's personal submission to William, conducted before an assembly of English and Norman nobles, provided symbolic closure to Anglo-Saxon dynastic claims while demonstrating the futility of continued resistance. The young Aetheling's treatment by William, who granted him lands and a position at the Norman court, established precedents for dealing with other members of the English nobility. The coronation of William as King of England at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day 1066 represented the culmination of his conquest campaign, though the ceremony's circumstances revealed the continuing tensions between Norman authority and English acceptance. Archbishop Ealdred's performance of the coronation ritual provided ecclesiastical legitimacy, while the presence of both Norman and English nobles suggested broad acceptance of the new regime. However, the disturbances that occurred outside the abbey during the ceremony, possibly triggered by Norman soldiers' misunderstanding of English acclamation customs, indicated the fragile nature of the political settlement. The establishment of Norman administrative control over England required systematic replacement of Anglo-Saxon governmental personnel with trusted Norman appointees, a process that began immediately following William's coronation but would continue for years as the new regime consolidated its authority. The complexity of English governmental structures, which had evolved over centuries of Anglo-Saxon rule, presented significant challenges for Norman administrators unfamiliar with local customs and legal traditions. William's solution involved retaining existing administrative frameworks while gradually inserting Norman personnel into key positions. The redistribution of English lands among Norman followers represented perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the conquest, fundamentally altering England's social and economic structures in ways that would persist for centuries. William's approach to this redistribution reflected both practical necessities and political calculations, as he needed to reward his supporters while maintaining sufficient English cooperation to ensure effective governance. The scale of this redistribution was unprecedented in medieval European history, involving the transfer of virtually all major landholdings from Anglo-Saxon to Norman control. The construction of castles throughout England began almost immediately following the conquest, as William recognised that maintaining Norman control over a hostile population required strategic strongholds capable of dominating key territories and communication routes. The first Norman castles utilised motte and bailey designs that could be constructed rapidly using local labour and materials while providing effective defensive positions for small Norman garrisons. These fortifications served multiple functions: military bases for suppressing local resistance, administrative centres for collecting taxes and enforcing royal authority, and symbols of Norman power that reinforced the psychological impact of conquest. The castle at Warwick, constructed within months of William's coronation, exemplified the strategic thinking behind Norman fortification policies. Its position commanded the crossing of the River Avon while controlling access routes between the Midlands and southern England. The fortress's garrison, consisting of approximately 100 Norman knights and men-at-arms, possessed sufficient strength to dominate the surrounding countryside while serving as a base for operations against potential resistance movements. The castle's construction required the demolition of numerous Anglo-Saxon buildings and the displacement of local populations, demonstrating the social costs of Norman security measures. The fortification of York represented an even more significant undertaking, as the city's strategic importance as the administrative centre of northern England made its control essential for Norman authority throughout the region. The construction of two separate castles, one on each side of the River Ouse, provided overlapping fields of fire that could dominate both the city and the surrounding countryside. These fortifications required substantial garrisons totaling nearly 500 men, reflecting both York's importance and the continuing threat of northern resistance to Norman rule. The resistance that erupted in northern England during 1068 revealed the limitations of Norman control beyond the immediate vicinity of their castle garrisons. The rebellion began in Northumbria, where English nobles led by Gospatric, a member of the traditional Northumbrian ruling family, coordinated attacks against Norman positions while seeking support from Scottish forces under King Malcolm III. The rebels' initial successes, including the capture of Durham and the massacre of its Norman garrison, demonstrated that English resistance retained significant capabilities despite the previous year's defeats. The Northumbrian rebellion's expansion into Yorkshire created the most serious threat to Norman rule since Hastings, as the rebels succeeded in besieging York while coordinating their operations with Danish forces that landed on the English coast in support of their cause. The Danish intervention, led by King Sweyn Estrithson's sons, provided the English rebels with experienced military leadership and substantial reinforcements that transformed a regional uprising into a national crisis. The combined English-Danish force that assembled around York numbered approximately 8,000 men, representing the largest concentration of anti-Norman forces since Harold's army at Hastings. William's response to the Northern Rebellion demonstrated both the military capabilities that had made his conquest possible and the ruthless determination that would characterise his suppression of English resistance. The king assembled a substantial army, estimated at nearly 4,000 men, combining Norman troops recalled from garrison duties with fresh reinforcements from Normandy and other continental territories. This force represented the largest military expedition William had mounted since his initial invasion, reflecting his recognition that failure to suppress the Northern Rebellion could encourage similar uprisings throughout England. The royal armies advanced towards York during the winter of 1069 to 1070 encountered systematic English resistance that forced Norman forces to fight for control of every strategic position along their route. English rebels had destroyed bridges, blocked roads, and established defensive positions that maximised the advantages of their local knowledge, while forcing Norman forces to operate in hostile territory during the most difficult season of the year. The campaign's duration, extending over several months, demonstrated both English determination and the challenges facing Norman forces operating far from their established bases. The recapture of York in early 1070 marked the beginning of the most notorious episode of William's reign, as the king ordered the systematic devastation of Yorkshire and adjacent counties in retaliation for their support of the rebellion. The harrying of the North, as this campaign became known, involved the deliberate destruction of agricultural resources, livestock, and infrastructure throughout vast regions of northern England. Norman forces burned crops, slaughtered cattle, destroyed mills and farming implements, and poisoned water sources in a coordinated effort to eliminate the economic foundations that could support future rebellions. The scale of destruction during the harrying exceeded anything previously witnessed in medieval European warfare, as William's forces systematically devastated territory covering approximately 60,000 square miles. Contemporary chroniclers, including Norman writers generally sympathetic to William's cause, described the devastation in terms that suggested genuine horror at the campaign's scope and intensity. The Domesday Book, compiled 20 years later, recorded vast areas of northern England as waste, indicating that recovery from the harrying's effects remained incomplete even after 2 decades. The human cost of the harrying of the North defied precise calculation, though contemporary estimates suggested that the population of affected regions declined by more than half during the campaign and its immediate aftermath. Starvation became widespread as Norman forces eliminated food supplies and agricultural capabilities, while disease outbreaks followed the disruption of normal sanitary and social arrangements. Refugee populations fled southward, carrying accounts of Norman brutality that reinforced English hatred of their conquerors while demonstrating the futility of continued resistance. The strategic effectiveness of the harrying in eliminating Northern English resistance proved complete, as no significant rebellions occurred in the affected regions for the remainder of William's reign. The devastation's psychological impact extended far beyond its immediate geographic scope, as English populations throughout the kingdom recognised that continued resistance would bring similar consequences to their own territories. The campaign established William's reputation for ruthless efficiency in suppressing opposition while demonstrating Norman capabilities for systematic warfare that exceeded traditional medieval limitations. The establishment of Norman control over the devastated northern territories required innovative administrative approaches that could govern depopulated regions while preventing the resurgence of English resistance. William's solution involved granting vast estates to trusted Norman nobles who received both the lands and the responsibility for repopulating and defending them. These grants, often encompassing entire counties, created a new class of Norman magnates whose wealth and power derived directly from royal favour and whose continued prosperity depended on maintaining effective control over their territories. The construction of castles throughout the harried regions provided the infrastructure necessary for Norman administrative control, while serving as centres for the systematic repopulation of devastated areas. These fortifications, numbering in the hundreds, established a network of Norman strongholds that could coordinate their defensive efforts while maintaining communication with royal authorities. The castle's garrisons, typically consisting of 20-50 men, possessed sufficient strength to dominate local populations, while serving as nuclei for the Norman settlements that gradually replaced the destroyed English communities. The systematic transformation of English governmental structures under Norman rule began within months of William's coronation, as the new king recognised that military conquest alone could not sustain long-term control over a population that vastly outnumbered his Norman followers. The administrative revolution that unfolded between 1067 and 1087 represented one of medieval Europe's most comprehensive reorganisations of state power, fundamentally altering the relationship between monarchy and nobility while establishing precedents for centralised governance that would influence English political development for centuries. William's approach to administrative reform reflected his understanding that effective royal authority required direct control over key governmental functions rather than reliance on traditional feudal delegation. The Anglo-Saxon system he inherited had evolved through centuries of gradual development, creating complex networks of local authority that often operated independently of royal oversight. Earls like Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria had wielded quasi-royal powers within their territories, maintaining their own military forces, judicial systems, and fiscal arrangements with minimal interference from the crown. This decentralised structure, while providing administrative flexibility, had also enabled the regional power bases that facilitated resistance to Norman conquest. The replacement of Anglo-Saxon earls with Norman appointees represented the most visible aspect of William's administrative centralisation, though the process involved far more than simple personnel changes. The new Norman earls received their positions as royal appointments rather than hereditary rights, creating a fundamental shift in the relationship between central authority and regional administration. Earl Hugh of Chester, appointed to control the strategically crucial Welsh borderlands, derived his authority entirely from royal grant and remained subject to direct royal oversight in ways that would have been unthinkable under the previous Anglo-Saxon system. His extensive powers over Chester and its surrounding territories came with explicit obligations to the crown that could be revoked for failure to meet royal expectations. The transformation of the English treasury system exemplified William's systematic approach to governmental centralisation. The Anglo-Saxon monarchy had relied heavily on local collection of royal revenues, with shire reeves and other regional officials maintaining significant discretion over fiscal matters. William's reforms established direct royal control over all major revenue sources, while creating standardised collection procedures that eliminated opportunities for local officials to divert funds from royal coffers. The establishment of the Royal Treasury at Winchester, staffed entirely by Norman clerks and supervised by trusted royal appointees, ensured that all significant financial transactions occurred under direct royal oversight. The expansion of royal judicial authority represented another crucial component of Norman administrative centralisation. Anglo-Saxon legal traditions had emphasised local courts and customary law, with royal intervention limited to the most serious criminal cases or disputes involving major nobles. William's judicial reforms gradually extended royal court jurisdiction over an expanding range of legal matters while establishing standardised procedures that superseded local customs. The creation of royal justices, typically Norman clerics with legal training, provided the Crown with direct agents capable of enforcing royal law throughout the kingdom without reliance on potentially unreliable local officials. The integration of Norman administrative practices with existing English governmental structures required sophisticated understanding of both system strengths and limitations. William's advisors, including Archbishop Lanfranc and other Norman intellectuals, possessed extensive experience with continental European administrative methods, while recognising the need to adapt these approaches to English conditions. The resulting hybrid system retained useful Anglo-Saxon institutions like the shire court system, while subjecting them to Norman oversight and standardisation that enhanced royal control. The development of written administrative records marked a revolutionary change in English governmental practice, as Norman administrators introduced systematic documentation procedures that transformed the monarchy's ability to monitor and control its resources. The Anglo-Saxon government had relied heavily on oral traditions and informal arrangements that, while functional within stable communities, provided adequate oversight for a conquest regime facing potential resistance. Norman scribes trained in continental European administrative practices established comprehensive record-keeping systems that documented land grants, tax assessments, judicial proceedings, and military obligations with unprecedented precision. The creation of royal chanceries in major administrative centres provided the institutional framework necessary for maintaining these expanded record-keeping requirements. The chancery at Winchester, staffed by approximately 30 clerks and scribes, produced thousands of documents annually documenting royal grants, judicial decisions, and administrative instructions. These documents, written in Latin according to standardised formats, created permanent records that could be referenced years or decades later to resolve disputes or verify obligations. The psychological impact of this documentation system extended beyond its practical utility, as the ability to produce written proof of royal grants or obligations reinforced Norman claims to legitimate authority. The Domesday Book project, initiated in 1085, represented the culmination of William's administrative centralisation and demonstrated the unprecedented scope of Norman governmental capabilities. The survey's origins lay in the king's need for accurate information about England's resources and population following 20 years of conquest and settlement. The massive undertaking required coordination between royal administrators, local officials, and community representatives throughout England, creating the most comprehensive governmental survey attempted in medieval Europe. The organisation of the Domesday Survey revealed the sophisticated administrative machinery that William had developed during his reign. Royal commissioners, typically consisting of a Norman baron, a clerk with legal training, and a local official familiar with regional conditions, travelled throughout England conducting systematic inquiries into land ownership, population, and economic resources. These commissioners possessed royal authority to compel testimony from all social classes, from great nobles to village peasants, while their diverse composition ensured both administrative competence and local knowledge necessary for accurate assessment. The standardised questionnaire used throughout the Domesday Survey demonstrated Norman commitment to systematic data collection that could support effective governmental decision-making. Each community faced identical inquiries about land ownership during Edward the Confessor's reign, changes that had occurred since the conquest, current population levels, agricultural resources, and tax-paying capacity. The Commissioner's instructions required them to verify information through multiple sources, comparing testimony from different social groups while examining physical evidence like charters and boundary markers. The scope of information collected during the Domesday Survey exceeded anything previously attempted by medieval governments, encompassing detailed data about approximately 13,400 settlements throughout England. The surveyors recorded not only basic information about land ownership and population, but also specific details about agricultural productivity, livestock numbers, industrial facilities like mills and fisheries, and even unusual resources like saltworks or vineyards. This comprehensive approach reflected William's understanding that effective royal authority required detailed knowledge of the kingdom's resources and capabilities. The compilation process for the Domesday Book required sophisticated organisational methods that pushed medieval administrative capabilities to their limits. The raw data collected by royal commissioners filled thousands of individual records that needed to be organised, cross-referenced, and compiled into coherent regional summaries. The scribes responsible for this compilation, working under the supervision of senior royal administrators, developed standardised formats and abbreviation systems that allowed them to process enormous quantities of information while maintaining accuracy and consistency. The political implications of the Domesday Survey extended far beyond its immediate administrative purposes, as the project demonstrated royal capabilities that intimidated potential opponents while reinforcing Norman claims to legitimate authority. The ability to conduct such a comprehensive survey required governmental resources and organisational sophistication that no previous English monarch had possessed. The survey's completion proved that Norman administration had achieved effective control over even the most remote regions of England, while establishing detailed records that could support future governmental actions. The ecclesiastical transformation that accompanied Norman administrative centralisation represented equally significant changes in England's religious and cultural institutions. William's appointment of Norman bishops and abbots to replace Anglo-Saxon church leaders reflected both practical administrative needs and broader cultural objectives that sought to align English religious practices with continental European norms. The systematic replacement of English ecclesiastical leadership completed within 15 years of the conquest eliminated potential centres of resistance while introducing administrative methods that supported royal authority. Archbishop Lanfranc's appointment to Canterbury in 1070 marked the beginning of comprehensive church reform that would fundamentally alter English religious institutions. Lanfranc's extensive experience as Prior of Bec had provided him with sophisticated understanding of both monastic administration and secular governmental practices, making him an ideal agent for implementing William's ecclesiastical policies. His scholarly reputation and theological expertise provided legitimacy for controversial reforms, while his administrative capabilities ensured effective implementation of royal directives. The replacement of English bishops proceeded systematically as positions became vacant through death or deposition, with William consistently appointing Norman clerics who possessed both theological training and administrative experience. Bishop Odo of Bayeux, William's half-brother, received the wealthy See of Kent along with extensive secular responsibilities that made him one of England's most powerful magnates. His dual role as bishop and royal administrator exemplified the integration of ecclesiastical and secular authority that characterised Norman governmental methods. The reform of English monasteries represented another crucial aspect of ecclesiastical transformation, as Norman abbots introduced continental European monastic practices while reorganising monastery administration to support royal objectives. The appointment of Abbot Paul to St Albans brought Benedictine reforms that emphasised scholarly activities and manuscript production, alongside traditional monastic observances. The monastery's scriptorium, expanded under Norman direction, became a major centre for producing the administrative documents that supported royal government, while maintaining religious texts that preserved Norman cultural traditions. The introduction of continental European feudalism into England required careful adaptation of Norman institutional practices to existing Anglo-Saxon social and legal structures. The feudal system that William implemented differed significantly from traditional Norman practices, reflecting the unique circumstances of governing a conquered kingdom where the entire landholding class had been replaced within a generation. The resulting hybrid system combined Norman feudal obligations with Anglo-Saxon legal traditions in ways that maximised royal control while providing sufficient incentives to ensure Norman loyalty. The redistribution of English lands among Norman followers created the foundation for this new feudal system, though the process involved far more than simple reward for military service. William's land grants established carefully calculated relationships between royal authority and noble obligation that ensured continued Norman dependence on royal favour. The largest grants, like those given to William Fitz-Osbern in Herefordshire and Roger Montgomery in Shropshire, created powerful magnates whose wealth and authority derived entirely from royal grant and whose continued prosperity required effective defence of their territories against Welsh raids and English resistance. The military obligations associated with these land grants reflected Norman understanding that maintaining control over England required constant military readiness. The feudal system that emerged from William's land redistribution established standardised military service requirements that could provide the Crown with substantial armed forces when circumstances required. Earl Roger Montgomery's obligation to provide 60 knights for royal service represented typical arrangements that created a military reserve distributed throughout England, while ensuring that the burden of defence fell primarily on Norman landholders rather than the royal treasury. The adaptation of Anglo-Saxon legal traditions to Norman feudal requirements created complex hybrid systems that reflected the practical necessities of governing a conquered population. English customary law, which had evolved over centuries of Anglo-Saxon development, contained numerous provisions that conflicted with Norman feudal practices, particularly regarding land tenure and inheritance rights. William's solution involved selective preservation of English legal traditions that supported royal authority while modifying or eliminating those that conflicted with Norman governmental objectives. The establishment of separate legal jurisdictions for Norman and English populations reflected the practical challenges of governing a culturally divided kingdom. Norman settlers retained access to continental European legal traditions through special courts that applied Norman customary law to disputes involving Norman participants. These courts, typically presided over by Norman nobles or royal officials, provided familiar legal procedures for Norman colonists while ensuring that their legal disputes received resolution according to standards they understood and accepted. The gradual integration of Norman and English legal systems occurred through careful expansion of royal court jurisdiction over matters that affected both populations. Marriage disputes, property transfers, and commercial transactions involving both Norman and English participants required legal frameworks that could accommodate both legal traditions while maintaining consistency in royal administration. The development of hybrid legal procedures that combined elements from both systems created precedents for the unified legal system that would eventually emerge from this period of institutional experimentation. The economic transformation that accompanied Norman administrative centralisation reflected systematic efforts to maximise royal revenues while supporting the Norman settlement that provided the conquest regime's foundation. The introduction of continental European commercial practices, combined with more efficient tax collection methods, substantially increased royal income while creating economic opportunities that encouraged Norman immigration and investment. The establishment of new markets and trading centres throughout England provided venues for commercial activities that generated tax revenues while supporting the specialised crafts and services that Norman colonists required. The reorganisation of English currency and monetary systems exemplified Norman commitment to administrative standardisation that could support expanded commercial activities. The introduction of new silver penny designs bearing William's image and titles provided visible symbols of Norman authority while ensuring standardised weights and silver content that facilitated commercial transactions. The establishment of royal mints in major administrative centres, staffed by Norman moneyers and supervised by royal officials, created a controlled currency production that prevented counterfeiting while generating substantial profits for the royal treasury. The development of royal forests represented another significant innovation that demonstrated Norman administrative capabilities while providing substantial economic benefits for the crown. The designation of vast areas as royal forests, subject to special laws and administered by royal foresters, created exclusive hunting preserves for the king while generating revenues through fines, licenses, and the sale of forest products. The new forest, created through the displacement of numerous English villages and agricultural settlements, exemplified the social costs of these economic policies while demonstrating royal power to reshape entire regions according to Norman preferences. The transformation of England under Norman rule created unprecedented challenges for William's governance of his continental territories, as the king found himself managing a cross-channel empire that stretched his administrative and military resources beyond any previous medieval ruler's experience. The wealth and strategic importance of England provided William with enhanced power and prestige, yet the constant demands of governing a recently conquered kingdom left his Norman heartland increasingly vulnerable to external threats and internal dissension. By 1070, the complex dynamics of ruling both England and Normandy had begun generating conflicts that would define the remainder of William's reign and establish patterns of Anglo-Norman political tension that would persist for generations. The relationship between William and King Philip of France underwent fundamental transformation following the Norman conquest, as the French monarch recognised that his formerly dependent vassal had acquired resources and territorial control that potentially challenged royal authority throughout northern France. Philip's accession to the throne in 1060 at age 7 had created opportunities for ambitious nobles to assert greater independence, but William's English revenues and military capabilities now posed threats that exceeded anything Philip's regents had previously confronted. The young French king's court included numerous advisors who viewed Norman expansion with alarm, particularly those whose own territorial ambitions conflicted with William's growing influence along France's northern borders. The first serious confrontation between Norman and French forces occurred in Maine during 1073, when local nobles led by Hubert of Beaumont-aux-Maines initiated a rebellion against Norman rule that received covert support from Philip's court. Maine's strategic position between Normandy and Anjou made its control crucial for William's continental security, while its loss would create dangerous precedents for other Norman territories facing internal dissent. The rebellion's leadership included experienced military commanders who had previously served under Norman authority, but had grown resentful of the administrative centralisation and tax increases that accompanied William's efforts to finance his English operations. Hubert of Beaumont's rebellion attracted support from disaffected Norman nobles who viewed William's English preoccupations as opportunities to assert greater independence within their own territories. The Count's forces, numbering approximately 2,000 men, included cavalry units equipped and trained according to Norman military standards, making them formidable opponents who understood Norman tactical methods while possessing intimate knowledge of local terrain and defensive positions. Their initial successes in capturing several fortified positions demonstrated that Norman military superiority could not be taken for granted when facing opponents who combined local advantages with professional military capabilities. William's response to the Maine Rebellion required careful balancing between English administrative demands and continental military necessities. The king assembled a substantial army from Norman garrisons and English resources, totaling roughly 3,500 men, but the expedition's organisation revealed the growing strains of managing a cross-channel empire. English revenues provided the financial resources necessary for mounting major continental campaigns, yet the troops required for these operations often came from Norman territories that were simultaneously facing their own security challenges from French expansion and Breton raids. The Siege of Le Mans, Maine's principal city, demonstrated both Norman military capabilities and the limitations imposed by divided attention between English and continental responsibilities. William's forces invested the city during the autumn of 1073, utilising siege engines and professional engineers drawn from both Norman and English resources. The operation's success required sustained commitment of substantial military forces over several months, during which English administrative matters continued to demand royal attention, while Norman territories remained vulnerable to external attack. The king's frequent travels between the siege lines and administrative centres illustrated the physical challenges of governing territories separated by the English Channel. The successful reduction of Le Mans in early 1074 eliminated organised resistance to Norman authority in Maine, though the campaign's costs demonstrated the financial and military burdens of maintaining control over scattered continental territories. William's treatment of captured rebels reflected his understanding that excessive severity might encourage future resistance, while insufficient punishment could be interpreted as weakness that invited additional challenges. The execution of Hubert of Beaumont and his principal lieutenants provided necessary examples, while lesser participants received pardons contingent upon renewed oaths of loyalty and payment of substantial fines that helped offset campaign costs. The establishment of Norman administrative control over the recovered Maine territories required innovations in governance that could prevent future rebellions, while maintaining effective oversight despite William's divided attention. The king appointed trusted Norman administrators to key positions throughout Maine, but these officials faced the challenge of governing populations that had demonstrated their willingness to support armed resistance against Norman authority. The construction of additional castles at strategic locations provided military bases for suppressing future unrest, while serving as administrative centres for collecting taxes and enforcing royal authority. King Philip's response to Norman success in Maine involved diplomatic and military initiatives designed to contain William's expanding influence, without precipitating open warfare that might unite Norman territories against French authority. The French court initiated negotiations with Breton nobles, particularly Duke Alan IV, regarding coordinated pressure against Norman positions along multiple frontiers. These diplomatic efforts reflected Philip's understanding that direct confrontation with William's combined Norman-English resources would likely result in French defeat, while coordinated pressure from multiple directions might force William to make territorial concessions or accept limitations on his continental expansion. The Breton dimension of these conflicts added complexity to William's strategic calculations, as Duke Alan IV possessed both the military capabilities and territorial ambitions necessary to pose serious threats to Norman security. Alan's forces had participated in the conquest of England, providing him with experienced commanders and substantial financial rewards that enhanced his military capabilities. However, traditional Breton-Norman rivalries over border territories and commercial rights created ongoing tensions that Philip could exploit to pressure William's western frontiers, while French forces threatened Norman positions from the east. The development of coordinated French-Breton military cooperation during 1075 created the most serious external threat to Norman territorial integrity since William's conquest of England. Joint operations between French and Breton forces targeted Norman positions along the contested borders of Maine and the Cotentin Peninsula, forcing William to divide his military resources between multiple threatened sectors. These coordinated attacks demonstrated sophisticated strategic planning that reflected Philip's growing political maturity and his advisors' understanding of Norman vulnerabilities created by William's English commitments. The Norman response to this coordinated pressure required military innovations that could maximise defensive capabilities while maintaining sufficient offensive strength to discourage enemy initiatives. William's commanders developed rapid response tactics that utilised the superior mobility of Norman cavalry to concentrate forces at threatened points while maintaining communication networks that provided early warning of enemy movements. The construction of additional fortifications at key strategic positions created defensive networks that could channel enemy attacks into predetermined killing zones while providing secure bases for launching counterattacks against retreating forces. The resolution of the French Breton coalition's threat occurred through a combination of military success and diplomatic manoeuvring that demonstrated William's sophisticated understanding of continental European politics. Norman forces achieved decisive victories against both French and Breton armies during 1076, inflicting casualties that eliminated their immediate offensive capabilities while capturing important enemy commanders whose ransom provided substantial financial benefits. Simultaneously, William's diplomatic agents negotiated separate agreements with French and Breton leaders that exploited their conflicting territorial ambitions while offering concessions that reduced their incentives for continued cooperation against Norman interests. The territorial adjustments that emerged from these negotiations reflected the complex balance of power that characterised northern French politics during the late 11th century. William acknowledged French suzerainty over certain disputed territories in exchange for Philip's recognition of Norman rights to Maine and other contested regions. These arrangements satisfied French concerns about Norman independence, while providing William with secure borders that could be defended with reduced military commitments. The agreement's implementation required ongoing diplomatic maintenance, but they created stability that allowed William to focus attention on other pressing governmental challenges. The relationship between William and his eldest son Robert Curthose represented another source of continental instability that reflected broader tensions within Norman noble families regarding inheritance rights and territorial control. Robert's position as designated heir to Norman territories created expectations of substantial authority and independent resources that conflicted with William's determination to maintain centralised control over all aspects of Norman governance. The young man's military experience, gained through participation in English campaigns and continental operations, had provided him with both practical capabilities and personal ambitions that increasingly chafed under his father's continuing oversight. The specific incident that precipitated open conflict between William and Robert occurred at L'Aigle in 1077, when a dispute between Robert and his younger brothers William Rufus and Henry escalated into violence that revealed the deep personal and political tensions within the Norman royal family. The confrontation began as a seemingly minor disagreement about precedence during a feast, but quickly developed into armed conflict when Robert's supporters clashed with those loyal to his brothers. The incident's escalation into serious violence reflected the broader competition for royal favour and inheritance rights that characterised relationships among William's sons. Robert's flight from his father's court following the L'Aigle incident marked the beginning of a prolonged period of family conflict that would plague William's final years and create opportunities for his enemies to exploit Norman internal divisions. The young man's departure for the French court provided King Philip with a valuable asset for pressuring William, as Robert's legitimate claims to Norman inheritance could be used to justify French intervention in Norman affairs. Robert's presence in Paris also attracted other disaffected Norman nobles who viewed the family conflict as an opportunity to assert greater independence from royal authority. The military capabilities that Robert assembled during his exile demonstrated both his personal leadership qualities and the extent of dissatisfaction among certain elements of Norman nobility with William's centralised governmental methods. Robert's forces, numbering approximately 1,500 men, included experienced knights who had served in English campaigns, alongside professional soldiers recruited from throughout northern France. These troops possessed equipment and training comparable to William's own forces, making them formidable opponents who understood Norman tactical methods while benefiting from French logistical support and strategic guidance. The Siege of Gerberoy in 1079 represented the climax of the conflict between William and Robert, as the fortress's strategic position near the Norman-French border made its control crucial for both sides' military operations. Robert's occupation of Gerberoy with French support created a direct threat to Norman territorial integrity, while providing him with a secure base for launching raids against his father's territories. The fortress's strong defensive position, enhanced by recent improvements funded by French resources, required substantial Norman forces to invest effectively while diverting military strength from other pressing security requirements. William's personal participation in the Gerberoy siege reflected both the operation's strategic importance and the deeply personal nature of his conflict with Robert. The king's presence at the siege lines provided necessary leadership for maintaining Norman morale during the difficult operation, while his direct involvement demonstrated royal determination to suppress challenges to his authority, regardless of their familial origins. The siege's duration, extending over several months, created substantial costs in both financial resources and military casualties, while providing ongoing opportunities for enemy propaganda that portrayed William as an unnatural father who made war against his own son. The dramatic encounter between William and Robert during a sortie from Gerberoy became one of the most famous incidents of medieval warfare, as father and son engaged in personal combat that nearly resulted in William's death. Robert's lance thrust wounded the king's horse and threw him to the ground, where he remained vulnerable to enemy attack until rescued by his household troops. The incident's psychological impact extended far beyond its immediate military consequences, as news of the king's near-death spread throughout Norman territories and encouraged additional challenges to royal authority from nobles who interpreted the event as evidence of divine displeasure with William's rule. The eventual resolution of the Gerberoy siege, through negotiated settlement rather than military victory, reflected both the operation's enormous costs and the political necessity of reconciling family divisions that threatened Norman stability. The agreement that emerged from these negotiations provided Robert with substantial territorial grants in Normandy, while maintaining William's overall authority as Duke and King. These arrangements satisfied Robert's immediate demands for independent resources, while preserving the essential unity of Norman territories under royal control. The administrative challenges of governing territories that spanned the English Channel required innovations in communication and coordination that pushed medieval governmental capabilities to their limits. William's court necessarily became itinerant, moving regularly between English and Norman administrative centres to maintain effective oversight of both kingdoms' affairs. The king's household, including essential administrative personnel and military commanders, accompanied these movements while maintaining duplicate administrative systems that could function independently when circumstances required separation. The development of reliable communication networks between England and Normandy became crucial for maintaining governmental effectiveness, despite the physical barriers imposed by the Channel crossing. Royal messengers, travelling on fast ships equipped for all-weather sailing, carried administrative correspondence and policy directives between William's various courts and administrative centres. These communication systems required substantial investments in ships, personnel and harbour facilities, while remaining vulnerable to weather conditions and enemy interference that could disrupt essential governmental functions. The financial integration of English and Norman resources created both opportunities and challenges for William's governmental administration. English wealth, derived from more advanced agricultural and commercial systems, provided resources that could support Norman military operations and administrative expansion. However, The transfer of funds between territories required complex arrangements involving Italian merchants and Flemish bankers who possessed the international connections necessary for managing cross-channel financial transactions. These arrangements created dependencies on foreign financial networks, while generating substantial transaction costs that reduced the efficiency of resource transfers. The coordination of military resources between English and Norman territories required careful balancing of defensive requirements against offensive capabilities in both regions. Norman knights serving in English garrisons provided experienced military leadership while English revenues supported their maintenance, but their absence from Norman territories created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Similarly, English feared levies could provide substantial military manpower for continental operations, but their deployment in Norman campaigns left English territories dependent on Norman garrisons for internal security. The cultural and linguistic barriers between Norman and English populations created additional administrative challenges that required sensitive management to prevent conflicts that could undermine governmental stability. Norman administrators serving in England faced constant difficulties in communicating with English populations who remained largely monolingual in Anglo-Saxon, while English officials working in Norman territories encountered similar linguistic obstacles. The gradual development of administrative interpreters and bilingual personnel provided practical solutions, but these arrangements remained inadequate for complex legal and administrative matters that required precise communication. The ecclesiastical dimensions of cross-channel governance created particular complications, as William's appointments of Norman bishops and abbots to English positions generated resentment among English clergy, while his English ecclesiastical revenues supported continental religious foundations that provided minimal benefits to English populations. Archbishop Lanfranc's role as William's principal advisor required him to balance English ecclesiastical interests against Norman political requirements, creating tensions that reflected broader conflicts between local religious traditions and royal administrative necessities. The final years of William's reign witnessed an intensification of the continental conflicts that had plagued his cross-channel empire since the conquest of England. By 1087, the now 59-year-old king faced mounting pressures from multiple directions. His son, Robert Curthose, continued to challenge ducal authority from his strongholds in Normandy. King Philip IV of France pursued increasingly aggressive policies designed to fragment Norman territorial control, and the physical demands of governing an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Loire Valley had begun to take their toll on William's health and administrative capabilities. The king's corpulent frame, which contemporary chroniclers noted had grown substantially during his later years, reflected both the sedentary nature of his administrative duties and the rich diet that accompanied his elevated status, though it also contributed to the mobility limitations that would prove crucial during his final campaign. The immediate cause of William's last military expedition lay in the disputed territory of the Vexin, a strategically vital region that controlled access routes between Normandy and the Ile-de-France. This area had remained a source of contention between Norman and French forces throughout William's reign, with both sides recognizing that control over its fortified positions could determine the balance of power in northern France. King Philip's recent construction of new fortifications at Mont, just 30 miles from Rouen, represented a direct threat to Norman security that William could not ignore without appearing weak to his own nobles and encouraging further French encroachments on Norman territory. The French fortifications at Mont utilised advanced military engineering that reflected the evolution of siege warfare during the 11th century. The town's defences included stone walls reinforced with timber palisades, multiple defensive towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, and sophisticated gate systems designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. These improvements, funded by French royal resources and supervised by experienced military engineers, created defensive capabilities that would require substantial Norman forces and extended siege operations to overcome. The fortress's position on elevated ground above the Seine River provided additional advantages, as its garrison could control river traffic while maintaining secure communication lines with French reinforcements. William's decision to personally lead the campaign against Mantes reflected both the operation's strategic importance and his recognition that successful completion would require the full weight of royal authority to maintain Norman morale during what promised to be a difficult siege. The king assembled approximately 4,000 troops for the expedition, including Norman cavalry units recalled from English garrisons, continental European mercenaries recruited through Italian financial networks, and siege specialists whose expertise would prove essential for reducing the French fortifications. The army's composition demonstrated the international character that Norman military operations had acquired, as William's resources now extended throughout Western Europe. The logistical preparations for the Vexin campaign revealed the sophisticated administrative machinery that William had developed during 20 years of cross-channel governance. Supply trains carrying siege engines, construction materials, and provisions for extended operations required coordination between Norman, English, and continental European sources. The siege engines alone, including mangonels, trebuchets, and battering rams, represented substantial investments in specialized military technology that reflected Norman commitment to maintaining superiority in siege warfare. These weapons, constructed by master craftsmen and transported by teams of oxen, could deliver stone projectiles weighing up to 300 pounds against enemy fortifications while providing psychological pressure that often proved as valuable as their physical destructive capabilities. The Norman advance toward Mantes during July 1087 proceeded through countryside that bore the scars of previous military campaigns, as repeated French and Norman operations had devastated much of the Vexin's agricultural infrastructure. Villages that had once supported substantial populations now consisted largely of abandoned buildings and overgrown fields, while the surviving inhabitants had learned to hide their remaining resources whenever military forces approached. This desolation reflected the broader costs of the territorial conflicts that had characterized William's later reign, as the competition between Norman and French authority had transformed productive agricultural regions into military wastelands that contributed little to either side's economic resources. The Siege of Mantes commenced in early August 1087 with Norman forces establishing investment positions that utilised the town's topography to maximise the effectiveness of their siege engines while minimising exposure to French defensive fire. William's engineers constructed elaborate earthworks and wooden towers that allowed Norman archers to engage French defenders at close range while providing protection for the siege engines that would breach the town's walls. The complexity of these siege works, requiring several weeks to complete, demonstrated the sophisticated military engineering capabilities that Norman forces had developed through decades of castle construction and siege warfare experience. The psychological dimensions of the siege proved as significant as its military aspects, as both sides recognised that the operation's outcome would influence broader perceptions of Norman strength and French resistance capabilities. William's presence at the siege lines provided visible evidence of royal commitment, while encouraging Norman troops who understood that their king shared the campaign's risks and hardships. French defenders, meanwhile, drew inspiration from their strong defensive position and expectations of relief forces that King Philip was reportedly assembling. The siege's duration, extending through the late summer months, created mounting pressure on both sides as casualties accumulated and resources diminished. The decisive assault on Mantes occurred during late August 1087, when Norman siege engines had created sufficient breaches in the town's defences to permit infantry attacks against French positions. The final storm involved coordinated attacks at multiple points along the defensive perimeter, with Norman cavalry exploiting breaches created by siege engines, while infantry units engaged French defenders in close combat within the town's streets. The fighting's intensity reflected both sides' understanding that the battle's outcome would determine not only Mante's fate, but also broader questions about Norman military capabilities and French resistance potential. The Norman victory at Mantes proved complete, with French defenders either killed, captured, or fled toward Paris, leaving William's forces in control of the town and its strategic position. However, the triumph's immediate aftermath witnessed events that would prove far more significant than the military success itself. As William rode through the conquered town, surveying the destruction caused by his siege engines and the subsequent sack, his horse stumbled among the rubble-strewn streets, throwing the corpulent king against the high pommel of his saddle with sufficient force to cause severe internal injuries. Contemporary accounts suggest that the impact ruptured internal organs, possibly including the bladder or intestines, creating wounds that medieval medical knowledge could neither properly diagnose nor effectively treat. The nature of William's injuries became apparent within hours of the accident, as the king experienced severe abdominal pain accompanied by fever and other symptoms that indicated serious internal trauma. Norman physicians, drawing upon the limited medical knowledge available in the 11th century, attempted various treatments including bloodletting, herbal remedies, and prayers for divine intervention, but their efforts proved inadequate against injuries that would challenge even modern surgical techniques. The king's condition deteriorated rapidly, forcing his commanders to abandon further military operations while arranging for his transport to a location where he could receive appropriate care during his final illness. The decision to transport William to the Priory of Saint-Gervais, located on a hill overlooking Rouen, reflected both practical considerations about medical care and symbolic recognition of the king's approaching death. The priory's location provided a peaceful environment away from the noise and activity of Rouen's urban centre, while its religious character offered appropriate spiritual preparation for William's final moments. The priory's monks, experienced in caring for the sick and dying, could provide the medical attention available within medieval or religious institutions, while ensuring that the king received proper spiritual guidance during his final weeks. William's condition during his stay at Saint-Gervais fluctuated between periods of apparent improvement and severe deterioration, creating uncertainty about his prognosis that complicated planning for the succession arrangements that his death would necessitate. During his more lucid moments, the king attempted to address the complex political and territorial questions that his death would create, particularly regarding the division of his territories among his sons. These discussions involved not only family members but also senior Norman nobles and ecclesiastical leaders, whose support would prove crucial for maintaining stability during the transition period that would follow William's death. The territorial divisions that William contemplated during his final illness reflected both practical considerations about his son's capabilities and strategic calculations about maintaining the strength of Norman territories against external threats. Robert Curthose, as the eldest son, possessed the strongest claim to the Norman duchy based on traditional inheritance customs, despite his previous rebellions against paternal authority. His military experience and established relationships with Norman nobles made him the logical choice for maintaining Norman territorial integrity, though his past conflicts with William created concerns about his reliability and judgment. William Rufus, the king's second son, had demonstrated both military competence and administrative capability during his service in English campaigns and governmental positions. His loyalty to his father during Robert's rebellions had earned him William's trust, while his understanding of English conditions made him well suited for governing the conquered kingdom. The decision to grant him the English crown reflected both personal preference and practical recognition that England's continued Norman control required leadership that understood the unique challenges of governing a recently conquered population. Henry, the younger son, received substantial monetary compensation in lieu of territorial grants, an arrangement that reflected both the limitations of available territories and recognition of his intellectual capabilities that might prove valuable in future administrative or ecclesiastical roles. The substantial sum of silver that constituted Henry's inheritance provided him with resources that could support independent political activities while avoiding the immediate territorial responsibilities that his older brothers would face. This arrangement also reflected William's understanding that Henry's youth and lack of established power bases made him unsuitable for immediate territorial leadership. The ecclesiastical dimensions of William's final arrangements involved extensive consultations with Archbishop Lanfranc and other senior church leaders regarding both spiritual preparation for death and practical measures for maintaining church-state cooperation during the coming succession period. The king's relationship with the English Church had provided crucial support for Norman rule, while his patronage of Norman religious institutions had created networks of ecclesiastical loyalty that would influence post-succession politics. These discussions addressed both immediate concerns about proper spiritual preparation and longer-term questions about maintaining ecclesiastical support for his sons' respective rules. The political implications of William's approaching death created anxiety throughout Norman territories, as nobles and administrators recognised that the succession period would create opportunities for internal conflicts and external threats that could fragment the territories that William had spent his lifetime consolidating. Messages dispatched to England and other Norman territories carried instructions for maintaining governmental continuity while preparing for the administrative changes that new rulers would inevitably introduce. These communications reflected William's understanding that effective succession required careful preparation rather than simply announcing inheritance arrangements. William's death occurred on September 9, 1087, in the early morning hours as the king succumbed to the internal injuries sustained during his final campaign. Contemporary accounts describe his final moments as peaceful, with the king receiving last rites from the priory's clergy while surrounded by family members and trusted advisors. His death marked the end of an era in European history, as the man who had transformed England through conquest and established one of medieval Europe's most powerful cross-channel empires finally succumbed to the physical limitations that even royal authority could not overcome. The immediate aftermath of William's death revealed the complex practical challenges that medieval societies faced when powerful rulers died, as the king's body required preparation for burial while his territories needed immediate governmental continuity to prevent political chaos. The king's corpulent frame, swollen further by the internal injuries that had caused his death, presented particular difficulties for the embalming procedures that would preserve the body during transport to its final resting place. Contemporary chroniclers noted the unseemly haste with which some courtiers departed Saint-Gervais following the king's death, abandoning ceremonial obligations in favour of securing their own political positions during the uncertain succession period. The division of William's territories among his sons proceeded according to the arrangements he'd established during his final illness, though the implementation of these plans required careful negotiation among the various parties involved. Robert Curthose assumed control of Normandy with the support of Norman nobles who recognised both his hereditary claims and his established relationships within Norman political networks. His accession occurred without significant opposition, though underlying tensions remained regarding his previous rebellions and questions about his administrative capabilities. William Rufus's succession to the English throne proved more complex, as his rule required acceptance by English nobles and ecclesiastical leaders who had limited previous contact with the new king. Archbishop Lanfranc's support proved crucial for legitimising the succession, as his endorsement provided ecclesiastical sanction, while his administrative experience ensured governmental continuity during the transition period. The Archbishop's influence with English nobles and his understanding of both Norman and English political traditions made him an essential intermediary for establishing William Rufus's authority. The succession crisis that emerged within months of William's death demonstrated the inherent instability of dividing territories that had been united under single rule for over 2 decades. Robert's control of Normandy and William Rufus's rule in England created competing centres of authority that inevitably generated conflicts over resources, territorial boundaries, and political influence. These disputes reflected broader questions about whether the cross-channel empire that William had created could survive division among multiple rulers with potentially conflicting interests. The rebellion that erupted in England during 1088 illustrated these succession tensions as Norman nobles led by Bishop Odo of Bayeux challenged William Rufus's authority while advocating for reunification of Norman territories under Robert Curthos's leadership. The rebellion's supporters argued that dividing William's inheritance violated both Norman customs and practical necessities for defending Norman territories against external threats. Their military campaigns, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated the continuing appeal of territorial unity among significant portions of the Norman nobility. The long-term consequences of William's conquest and the governmental innovations he introduced fundamentally transformed English society in ways that extended far beyond the immediate political changes associated with Norman rule. The systematic replacement of Anglo-Saxon noble families with Norman landholders created entirely new social hierarchies based on continental European feudal principles rather than traditional English customs. This transformation affected not only the highest levels of society, but also local communities throughout England, as new Norman lords introduced different agricultural practices, legal procedures, and cultural expectations that gradually displaced Anglo-Saxon traditions. The linguistic transformation that accompanied Norman rule represented one of the most profound and lasting changes in English cultural development. The introduction of Norman French as the language of government, law, and high culture created a bilingual society where social advancement required mastery of continental European linguistic traditions. This linguistic division reinforced social hierarchies while introducing thousands of French words into English vocabulary, fundamentally altering the language's structure and expressive capabilities. The gradual merger of Norman French and Anglo-Saxon linguistic elements over subsequent generations created the distinctive characteristics of Middle English that would influence literary and cultural development for centuries. The architectural revolution that Norman rule brought to England reflected broader cultural changes that accompanied political conquest. The construction of stone castles throughout England introduced continental European architectural styles, while demonstrating Norman commitment to permanent settlement and territorial control. These fortifications, numbering in the hundreds by the end of William's reign, created defensive networks that could maintain Norman authority while serving as centres for the cultural and economic activities that supported Norman colonisation efforts. The ecclesiastical transformation that William's reign brought to English religious institutions proved equally significant for long-term cultural development. The appointment of Norman bishops and abbots introduced continental European religious practices while establishing closer connections between English churches and Roman ecclesiastical authority. The construction of new cathedrals and monasteries in Norman architectural styles created visible symbols of religious change, while providing institutional frameworks for preserving and transmitting Norman cultural traditions to subsequent generations. The legal innovations that emerged from Norman rule created hybrid systems that combined continental European legal principles with Anglo-Saxon customary practices. The gradual development of common law procedures that could address disputes involving both Norman and English populations established precedents for unified legal systems that would influence English jurisprudence for centuries. These legal developments reflected broader processes of cultural integration that transformed both Norman and English traditions through sustained contact and mutual adaptation. The economic changes that accompanied Norman rule fundamentally altered England's commercial and agricultural systems through the introduction of continental European practices and the integration of English resources into broader European trading networks. The establishment of new markets and trading centres throughout England provided venues for commercial activities that connected English producers with continental European consumers while introducing new products and technologies that enhanced agricultural productivity. These economic developments created wealth that supported the cultural and architectural achievements that characterised Norman England while establishing England's position as a major European economic power. The administrative innovations that William introduced created governmental systems that could effectively manage resources and maintain authority across vast territories, despite the communication and transportation limitations of medieval technology. The development of comprehensive record-keeping systems, standardised legal procedures, and centralised financial management established precedents for effective royal government that would influence English political development throughout the medieval period. These administrative achievements demonstrated the possibility of creating unified governmental systems that could transcend traditional local and regional boundaries. The military innovations that emerged from Norman conquest established England as a major European military power, while introducing tactical and organisational methods that would influence medieval warfare throughout Western Europe. The combination of Norman cavalry tactics with English infantry traditions created hybrid military systems that proved effective against various types of opponents, while establishing precedents for professional military organisation that would characterise later medieval armies. The construction of extensive castle networks provided defensive capabilities that could maintain territorial control with relatively small garrison forces while creating bases for offensive operations that extended English influence throughout the British Isles. The cultural synthesis that gradually emerged from Norman-English interaction created distinctive traditions that combined continental European sophistication with Anglo-Saxon practical capabilities. The development of Anglo-Norman literary traditions, architectural styles, and artistic expressions reflected the creative potential of cultural fusion while establishing England's distinctive identity within medieval European civilization. These cultural achievements provided foundations for the intellectual and artistic developments that would characterise later English cultural history, while demonstrating the positive potential of conquest and colonisation when managed with sufficient skill and sensitivity. William's legacy as one of medieval Europe's most significant rulers rests not only on his military achievements in conquering England, but also on his success in creating governmental and cultural institutions that could survive his death while continuing to influence European development for centuries. His transformation of England from an isolated Anglo-Saxon kingdom into a major European power established precedents for effective cross-channel governance, while demonstrating the possibility of creating unified political systems that could transcend traditional ethnic and cultural boundaries. The Norman conquest stands as one of history's most successful examples of how military conquest, when combined with sophisticated governmental and cultural policies, could create lasting institutional changes that fundamentally altered the trajectory of European civilization.